Hey guys, tonight we are travelling back to the edge of everything. The place where the land didn't end, but the maps did. This is the American frontier, and you probably won't survive this, not even kidding. Between the diseases, the accidents, the clashes, the wild animals, and the sheer bone-snapping logistics of 19th century life, your odds are generously terrible, but that's not going to stop you, is it? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what city are you in and what time are you watching this? I'm always curious. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin, fittingly, in myth. The American frontier doesn't start on American soil, not really. It starts in the heads of people who've never seen a prairie, never smelled the sweet rot of a mangled buffalo carcass baking under the sun, never brushed past a mesquite bush with their skin prickling from dehydration. It starts across the ocean, in Europe, where kings and merchants and peasants alike have begun to imagine a world beyond their overcrowded, blood-splattered empires. It's the late 1400s, and the land across the Atlantic is still in their minds shimmering with mystery, filled with riches, and conveniently empty. If you ignore the inconvenient reality that millions of people already live there, you're living at a time when the idea of the frontier is less about westward expansion and more about possibility. Boundaries are dissolving. The old certainties, church dominance, feudal loyalties, the limits of the known world are cracking. And when Europeans hit the shores of North America, they don't just bring goods and guns, they bring stories. Stories of gold, stories of Eden, stories of lands that bend to the will of a determined man. The idea that the land can be owned, sold, tamed, that the wilderness exists to be overcome. And oh, how that idea will haunt every corner of the continent. You're on the edge of the new world. It's the 1600s now, and thin, nervous English colonies are hugging the Atlantic coast like they're afraid to let go. And to be fair, they have reason to be. It's rough out there. Winters are cruel, crops fail, indigenous nations, who understandably don't love the whole "we're just going to take this land now" approach, resist. Sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through very persuasive arrows and fire. Disease spreads in both directions, wiping out communities, destabilizing alliances, and creating chaos. But still, the dream persists. The frontier isn't a place yet, it's a direction. West. Always west. One historical fact that often gets skimmed over in school, even early on colonists knew this wasn't just about surviving, it was about expansion. The Virginia Company, for example, didn't just fund Jamestown because they liked adventure. They were expecting returns. Timber, tobacco, fur, silver, anything. They printed maps with open western spaces labelled with tantalising names like Apalchen or Wingandacoa, which were real indigenous words mangled into European dreams. The point is, the land meant something long before most people had ever seen it. But here's a quirky little wrinkle, something fringe maybe, but revealing the myth of the Welsh Indians. Yeah, in the 1600s there were persistent rumours in England that a lost tribe of Welsh people had come to North America in the 1100s and were now living somewhere deep in the interior, happily blending with the native populations. Totally made up, of course, but the fact that people wanted to believe it says something. Europeans needed the frontier to feel familiar. Tameable, like maybe there were already little bits of them out there in the wild, just waiting to be rediscovered. It's wild speculation dressed up as comfort food. Meanwhile, indigenous nations across the continent, yes, the entire continent, have been living for centuries with deeply rooted cultures, trade routes stretching thousands of miles, and systems of law, land, and diplomacy that rival anything in Europe. This is not an empty wilderness, this is their world, and that reality will remain inconvenient to every new map drawn over the next few centuries. Here's where the scholarly debate rolls in. When did the American frontier actually begin? Some historians argue it didn't exist until after the US became a nation, that colonial expansion was just imperial sprawl. Others say the frontier is more of a mindset than a moment, a persistent belief that the answer to any problem lies just a little farther west. No one agrees, really. And that ambiguity will follow us the entire way. By the 1700s, the frontier is starting to get teeth. Colonial borders are being pushed westward with increasing aggression. You're seeing forts pop up deep into indigenous territory. French fur traders are mingling with tribes along the Mississippi River. British settlers are crawling over the Appalachians, technically in violation of treaties, but when has that ever stopped anyone? This is the dawn of the American frontier in the classic sense. The beginning of the long, slow, often violent, often romanticized crawl from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Ocean. It's not inevitable. It's not clean. And it sure as hell isn't empty. But you're standing on the shoreline looking inland, and somewhere deep in the woods, someone is already drawing a line in the soil and calling it destiny. Now let's get your boots muddy. You're no longer a speculative dreamer staring west from a castle in Europe. You're in the thick of it. The year's somewhere around 1675, and the East Coast colonies are beginning to bulge at their seams. The frontier is still a slippery concept, but here you are, walking in the worn, damp footprints of the first real frontiersmen. Fur trappers, traders, and explorers, most of whom smell strongly of bear fat and regret. These are not the polished men of the Enlightenment. They're half-wild, semi-literate, multilingual survivalists who live half their lives in bark huts and the other half running from things with claws. Their world is soaked in mud, sweat, and smoke, and that's on a good day. The fur trade is booming. Beaver pelts are practically currency now, with a single, soft, luxurious hide fetching big money back in Europe, where gentlemen want fashionable hats and women want coats that don't scream barnyard chic. You join a loose confederation of French, Dutch, English, and later American traders plunging into river systems so vast they might as well be roads. You paddle canoes so narrow they wobble like soup spoons, loaded with iron pots, gunpowder, and wool blankets. Trade goods, things that make indigenous leaders pause before shooting you with arrows. And that's the thing, you're not alone out here, far from it. You're entering indigenous territory, which is to say, you're always in indigenous territory. This isn't some untouched Eden. It's a living continent already in motion, already claimed, already governed by complex webs of diplomacy, kinship, and fierce territoriality. You're passing through lands belonging to the Iroquois Confederacy, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Cherokee, and dozens of other sovereign nations who absolutely know you're here and are definitely keeping score. Many of these early frontiersmen, notably the French coureurs des bois, learn quickly that survival means adaptation. You start dressing like the locals, sleeping under skins, eating pemmican, which, let's be honest, tastes like meaty sadness mixed with desperation, and speaking whatever trade pidgin gets your point across. Some even marry into tribes, not just for love or companionship, but as a savvy political move. And there's a name for this blend of cultures, the Métis, people born of both indigenous and European descent, carving out their own identities along these blurry, dangerous borderlands. Historically, it's the French who really lean into this cross-cultural cooperation. Unlike the British, who often try to dominate and displace, the French see value in partnerships. A fur alliance is often sealed with gifts, respect, and a fair bit of ceremonial tobacco. These alliances aren't just economic, they're diplomatic lifelines. And they help make the fur trade into the first real frontier industry, a business model that stretches from the Hudson River to the Rocky Mountains long before any wagons creak over the plains. But here's your quirky twist. Some of these trappers become so absorbed into the wilderness they go fully feral. There are actual reports of white frontiersmen forgetting how to speak English, rejecting their own families, and disappearing into tribal societies forever. One guy, a Frenchman named Jean-Baptiste Lolo, ended up as a sort of mountain mystic in what's now British Columbia. He wore furs, spoke over half a dozen native languages, and locals called him Saint Paul of the Mountains. Others simply vanish, absorbed into the landscape like ghosts in buckskin. Still, for every beaver pelt you trade, there's a creeping sense of tension. You're part of a machine that's starting to chew through the ecosystem. Beavers don't reproduce fast enough to keep up with European greed, and rivers that once sparkled with the sleek shimmer of 1,000 swimming hides now run quiet and empty. The land is beginning to feel the pressure, even if most folks haven't noticed yet. And here comes our first real scholarly fistfight. Who was the first frontiersman? Some historians give credit to folks like Daniel Boone. He'll come up later, don't worry. But others argue that unnamed indigenous guides, African slaves, and even ambitious runaway apprentices were the true firsts. After all, the frontier wasn't just opened by bold, rugged white men. It was shaped by everyone they depended on, people who rarely made it into the paintings, the textbooks, or the cowboy ballads. So you're out here, possibly freezing, possibly boiling, living in a mosquito-infested marsh next to a fire that won't light. You've traded away everything you carried for a sack of damp pelts and a few promises from a trader who may or may not come back next season. There are wolves howling just beyond the tree line, and you're not sure if that was a war cry you heard echo off the cliffs or just the wind playing tricks again. But there's a moment, just before dawn, when the mist clings low to the ground and the trees stand tall and still like ancient cathedral columns. You sip cold water from a birch bark cup to a strip of salted meat, and you feel it, the frontier, not as a place but as a rhythm, a pulse, an ever-moving edge where rules fray and new worlds form in the space between maps. One last detail before you crawl back into your bearskin bedroll. The fur traders left more than just a trail of pelts behind them. They created the first rough networks of contact, exchange and conflict that would later evolve into forts, towns and eventually cities. Detroit started as a French fur trading post. St. Louis, same deal. These men, half wild and half civilized, carved their lives into the forests and rivers, and the scars they left behind still shape the country today. You're just one of thousands, scratching out a living at the edge of something vast and unknowable. And out there, just over the next ridge, are new people, new landscapes, and new kinds of trouble you haven't even imagined yet. Now the mist lifts, and you start to see what was always here. You've spent a few years thinking you were carving your way through uncharted wilderness, but no, you're the latecomer. This land doesn't need discovering. It's been mapped by footsteps for thousands of years, and tonight you step quietly into a world already humming with ancient rhythms, carefully arranged seasons, and a memory that reaches so far back it makes the United States look like a toddler in buckskin pajamas. You're now inside the real heart of the pre-colonial continent. Long before words like frontier or pioneer meant anything, this land was shaped by the people who knew it best. You pass through dense forests that have been managed by fire and ritual, not chaos. Grasslands burned strategically to encourage buffalo. Forests thinned with purpose. Rivers stocked, redirected, understood. This wasn't untouched nature. It was a carefully lived-in landscape. You find yourself amid trade routes that span thousands of miles. Yes, thousands. Long before any Europeans sneezed into the Atlantic and decided to go sailing, indigenous nations were trading obsidian from the Rockies, shells from the Gulf, copper from the Great Lakes, and flint from the Northeast. A person living near Cahokia, the sprawling Mississippian city near present-day St. Louis, could have access to materials from what would one day be Canada, Mexico, and everything in between. The idea that these were isolated tribes scratching out survival stories is one of the biggest myths in the whole Western genre. Cahokia itself, by the way. It's a city with earthen mounds taller than the pyramids of Egypt. At its peak around the 12th century, it had a population rivaling London. It had wooden palisades, temples, a massive plaza, and a grand pyramid known as Monk's Mound. You walk through its ghostly footprint now, wondering how it faded so thoroughly from public memory. Disease, climate shifts, intertribal shifts. Historians still debate the cause, but for a long time, this was a cultural and economic center in a region most school children only learn about through Oregon Trail memes. This brings us to one of the most unsettling facts the textbooks tend to breeze past. The Americas were densely populated. Some estimates suggest 50 to 100 million people lived across the two continents before 1492. That number's still debated, and here's your scholarly split. But what's clear is this. European contact brought disease on a scale the world had never seen. Smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses that had centuries to simmer in Europe, hitched a ride on boats and exploded across the land like wildfire. You're talking about death rates of 80 to 90% in some areas. Entire villages gone within weeks. Some cities, like Cahokia, may have already declined before Europeans arrived, but others were wiped out in real time. That's the context you're stepping into. The land seems empty, not because it always was, but because it was emptied. Now, a quirky little corner of this tale. Did you know that ancient native civilizations had calendar systems? We're not just talking vague lunar guesses here. The ancestral Puebloans, what some call the Anasazi, built structures aligned to the solstice. At Chaco Canyon, sunlight pierces stone like a clockwork blade on specific days of the year. These were people with a keen sense of time, balance, and engineering. They built multi-story complexes out of sandstone and adobe, often taller than anything Europeans were building in the New World for centuries. You run your hand along the sun-warmed wall of a ruin in what will one day be New Mexico and realize this was never wilderness. This was a continent full of cities. And yet, even as cities rose, many indigenous communities lived more nomadic or semi-nomadic lives. The Plains tribes followed bison herds across open grasslands, creating mobile economies and lightweight housing like teepees. Woodland peoples developed as seasonal migration patterns tied to rivers, hunting cycles, and agriculture. Others, like the Iroquois Confederacy, formed political alliances that stunned early colonists with their complexity and effectiveness. Some scholars even argue that parts of the US Constitution were influenced by Iroquois governance models, something hotly debated, but tantalizing nonetheless. As you move across this invisible map, you begin to see something else. Each tribal nation has its own language, religion, economy, diplomacy, and deeply rooted sense of place. These aren't scattered fragments of culture. They're interwoven civilizations, and they are watching you. You arrive near what will one day be upstate New York and step into an Iroquois council meeting. Not literally, of course, you're not invited, but imagine the precision, the ceremony, the layers of consensus building that make this alliance strong enough to resist both British and French manipulation for decades, and yet though cracks will form, old enemies will be rearmed, trade will tip balances, and soon this world will shift under the weight of guns, steel, and constant relentless pressure from the east. Here's what's most important though. You need to shed the image of the noble savage or the savage, both tired inventions that filtered native people through the European gaze. Instead, understand this. Indigenous nations were nations. Not just tribes, not just footnotes. They were the original sovereigns of this continent, and for hundreds of years they weren't losing ground. They were negotiating, adapting, outmaneuvering, and often outlasting the people trying to settle them. But that's about to change. The tide is turning. Even now rumours are flying about English settlements pushing past the Appalachians. French forts are snaking south from Quebec. The Spanish are flexing their hold on the southwest. And the frontier is no longer just a fur-trading highway. It's about to become a battleground of empires. You stand on a bluff as the sun dips below the trees. Behind you is a continent alive with memory. Ahead lies a storm of flags, muskets, and manifest destinies not yet spoken aloud. The land doesn't forget, but people will try to make it forget, and that, more than any skirmish or homestead, will define the long story of the frontier. Now the trail tightens. You're walking west, but the mountains don't care. For decades now, colonists have crept outward from the coast like spilled ink. Virginia tobacco planters, Pennsylvania farmers, New England towns bursting at their seams. Everyone wants land, cheap land, untouched, allegedly available land. But eventually, no matter where you start, your boots hit the spine of the Appalachians, and they hit hard. These aren't cute little hills. These are dark, ridged barriers wrapped in dense forest, home to mountain lions, cold fog, and an unspoken warning: this is the edge of your world. Everything west of here belongs to someone else. You try to cross anyway. It's the early 1700s now, and the British colonies are no longer weak little coast huggers. They are building population, wealth, ambition. But geography has opinions. The Appalachian Mountains stretch from Alabama up to Canada, and they're more than just rock. They're a natural wall, a cultural boundary, and increasingly a political flashpoint. You stand in a narrow mountain pass, wind slicing through your coat, and you understand why this was once called the American Barrier. It's not just the physical challenge, it's the fact that the other side isn't empty, and never was. Beyond the mountains lies the Ohio River Valley, a lush, tangled stretch of land that pulses with opportunity. Rich soil, endless game, wide rivers for trading and transport. Everyone wants a piece. The British claim it vaguely by way of colonial charters that stretch all the way to the Pacific if you're bold and wildly optimistic. The French claim it more actively, planting forts along rivers and building ties with indigenous nations. And the people already living there, Shawnee, Lenape, Mingo, Miami, and many others, well, they claim it by the simple fact of being there. Here's your historical moment. By the mid-18th century, these overlapping claims crash into each other in a series of small fights that eventually snowball into a massive war, the French and Indian War, known elsewhere as the 7 Years' War. You're caught in the middle of this brewing powder keg. Picture it. Small groups of British colonial militiamen, men like a very young George Washington, trying to push into the Ohio Valley, awkwardly negotiating and often misreading tribal politics, and then accidentally sparking international conflict. It's like trying to light a campfire and accidentally blowing up a gunpowder warehouse. One of the strangest events in this build-up is the so-called Jumonville affair in 1754, where young Washington and his men ambush a French patrol and a native ally, Mingo leader Tanacharison, proceeds to execute a French officer with a hatchet to the skull. It's brutal, it's political, it's completely outside the plan, and it sets the stage for open war. You begin to see the pattern that will repeat itself across the entire frontier. Colonists push past a barrier, mountains, rivers, treaties, whatever. Conflict erupts. The crown or government steps in, usually too late. Indigenous alliances shift, sometimes in favour of colonists, sometimes against, and the line moves west again. But here's a quirky detail you might not expect. In the thick of this chaos, land speculators are already scheming. People like the Ohio Company, yes, it sounds like a front for a Bond villain, are buying up huge chunks of the contested land on paper, hoping to sell it off to settlers once it's cleared. One of the investors in this little real estate hustle, George Washington. That's right. The future first president of the United States has already dipped his boots into Western land speculation before the country is even a glimmer in his powdered wig. And yet, the British government, tired of funding frontier wars, tries to slam on the brakes. After winning the French and Indian War in 1763, they issue the Royal Proclamation, drawing a hard line along the crest of the Appalachians and declaring everything west of it off-limits to colonial settlers. It's a peace offering to the indigenous nations who helped them win. It's also utterly unenforceable, because guess what? Settlers ignore it, surveyors ignore it, Washington ignores it. The land hunger doesn't stop for royal decrees. There's an open scholarly debate about the impact of this proclamation. Some argue it helped ignite the American Revolution, planting early seeds of rebellion by pitting colonial ambition against imperial restraint. Others say it was too little, too late. A speed bump, not a roadblock, but you, walking through the tangled underbrush of western Pennsylvania or Kentucky, don't care about legal debates. You just want land, and you're willing to steal it, fight for it, or die trying. And die many do. The frontier isn't just settlers versus natives. It's also settler versus settler, tribe versus tribe, and everyone versus nature. Imagine crossing the mountains with your family, wagons groaning under the weight of all your earthly belongings, and losing everything in a flash flood or bear attack or fever. You wouldn't even make the footnotes. Whole communities vanish, and the forest swallows their bones. Still, some survive. They carve out homesteads, dig cellars, plant corn in the shadows of hills, and slowly, painfully push the line westward. These are the people who get mythologized later, raccoon cap heroes, noble yeomen. But in reality, they're broke, hungry, and constantly at risk of being shot, scalped, or starved. They're stubborn, sometimes heroic, sometimes horrifying, and they are changing the land forever. You pause now at the top of a ridge, the wind tugging at your cloak. Behind you lies a world of treaties and kings, ahead something older, messier, and much more dangerous. The Appalachians didn't stop you, but they sure tried. And now that you're over them, you're not just a settler anymore, you're a trespasser. You feel it in the ground now, the tension. The footsteps that shouldn't be there. The air is thick with smoke that isn't coming from your campfire. This isn't just the frontier anymore. It's a powder keg, and someone just handed you a lit match. Welcome to the Ohio Valley Wars. It's the late 1700s, and the official maps still call this region Dispute. But on the ground, there's no confusion. The British, freshly victorious from the French and Indian War, are technically in control. If by control you mean a handful of isolated forts, exhausted troops, and scattered settlers ignoring every imperial rule ever written. The French are gone in name only. Their old alliances with indigenous nations linger like smoke. And the native peoples, who've lived here for generations, are looking at this chaotic free-for-all and making choices. Strategic ones. Because if the Europeans want this land, they're going to have to bleed for it. You walk through what will become western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, maybe Kentucky, if you're unlucky. The forest seems quiet, but it's full of whispers, warnings, negotiations, and the occasional musket ambush. Tribes like the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, and Wyandot know the territory intimately, and they know what's at stake. They've seen treaties broken like cheap pottery. They've seen land swallowed up by endless fences and cabins, and they're not interested in slow extinction. So you get Pontiac's War, a fast, violent reaction in the 1760s to British arrogance and aggressive settlement. Indigenous leaders like Pontiac of the Ottawa Confederacy rally warriors across tribal lines to push back hard. They capture forts, burn settlements. They lay siege to Fort Detroit for months, and suddenly the British realise they may have won the territory, but they absolutely don't control it. And here's the twist. The British response isn't to crush them outright, it's to pause, to try diplomacy. That royal proclamation line we talked about? It wasn't just paperwork, it was a panic move. The British needed time to regroup, time to heal relations with tribes that had kept their empire afloat. But that line on the map, the proclamation line of 1763, was drawn with ink, not blood. Settlers didn't respect it. Land companies ignored it. George Washington again filed land claims across it, repeatedly, and nothing says we come in peace quite like silently buying up someone else's homeland. You're now a settler trying to put up a cabin near the forks of the Ohio, and you know what happens next. Your neighbours are killed in the night, or you are. Retaliation follows, then counter-retaliation. A cycle of raids, massacres and terror tightens around the valley like a garrote. The British Army, already stretched thin, can't or won't protect you. And slowly, almost casually, the colonial attitude begins to shift. If the Crown won't protect its people, maybe it's time for a new arrangement. One lesser-known episode during this period involves the murder of Cornstalk, a respected Shawnee leader who had tried repeatedly to keep peace with the colonists. In 1777, during the height of tensions, he visits an American fort to talk peace, only to be imprisoned and then murdered by enraged militiamen. No trial, no justification. Just rage and fear and the gnawing sense that war is coming and everyone's choosing sides. You might say that's the moment diplomacy dies in the Ohio Valley. And yes, this bleeds directly into the American Revolution. The frontier becomes a second war within the war, a shadow war of skirmishes, raids, and personal vendettas. Some tribes side with the British, believing, correctly it turns out, that the colonists are the bigger threat to their lands. Others, like the Oneida, side with the rebels, hoping for a better deal. Spoiler, no one gets a good deal. There's an open scholarly debate about how central the frontier was to the Revolution. Some say it was a distraction, a brutal sideshow compared to the polished battlefields of Lexington and Yorktown. Others argue it was the true war, the real contest over who would control the future of the continent. Either way, it's impossible to ignore the blood-soaked reality. While grand speeches echoed in Philadelphia, entire native villages were burned to the ground by rebel militias. And just to make it all weirder, here's a quirky twist for your collection. During all this, a tiny faction of Americans tried to create an entirely new state out of this chaotic zone. It was called Transylvania. No vampires, unfortunately, just land speculators with absurd ambition. They negotiated with the Cherokee, bought huge swathes of Kentucky and Tennessee, and declared themselves a sovereign entity. Congress, unsurprisingly, said, no, but for a moment the future of this area was up for grabs in the strangest ways. Back on your path, you keep walking, you pass burned-out homesteads, half-built cabins abandoned mid-construction, and graves without names. You see the line shift again and again, treaty after treaty signed under duress, then broken without ceremony. You witness the rise of frontier forts, built not to launch conquests but to survive. You hear rumours of Daniel Boone out in Kentucky, carving trails through the woods, fighting off raids, losing children, and becoming the kind of legend people invent when they need to believe in progress. But progress is a knife. For every mile gained, something is lost. For every new settlement, a nation disappears a little more. The Ohio Valley is bleeding out, and you're standing in the flood. This isn't just land, it's the soul of the early republic being fought over in real time. The war for the frontier is far from over. But by now, you've figured out something important. The frontier isn't just a place, it's a wound that you wake up one morning and the world has doubled. No one asked you if it should. You didn't vote on it. You probably didn't even understand what just happened. But in 1803, the young, scrappy United States of America wrote a check for $50 million and bought a piece of land so big it barely fit on the maps of the time. You didn't just buy Louisiana, you bought the idea of endless frontier. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a land deal, it was a national hallucination dressed up as a real estate bargain. You stand at the edge of the Mississippi River and stare west. On paper, this is all yours now, all 2 million square kilometres of it. On paper. That's the funny thing, no one really knows what's out there. Not Thomas Jefferson, who authorised the purchase from Napoleon in a moment of geopolitical panic, not the French, who technically didn't control most of it anyway. And definitely not you, standing in your muddy boots, staring into a horizon thick with rumour. Here's the historical headline: Napoleon needed money, Jefferson needed territory, and suddenly the United States owned a stretch of land that reached from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It doubled the size of the country overnight. No one even told the people who lived there. Why would they? Treaties are written in Paris and Washington, not in the villages along the Missouri River. And this deal, this absurd, arrogant piece of paperwork, is going to shape everything that follows. It's the spark that lights the next chapter of the frontier. It's also arguably the moment the US officially commits to being an empire, whether it calls itself one or not. Expansion becomes the national mood, land hunger becomes policy, and the people already living in that land, they just became a problem. The Louisiana Territory is a swirling mess of geography, politics, and myth. You're told it's full of rich farmland and friendly tribes. You're told it's lightly inhabited, ripe for civilization. You're told there might be woolly mammoths still roaming around out there. Seriously, Jefferson believed it. He even had books about it. No one really knew what was west of the Mississippi. For all practical purposes, it could have been Middle Earth. And that brings us to one of the most important and most absurd decisions in early US history: sending 2 guys to go check it out. Lewis and Clark are coming soon, but before we trail behind them, you need to understand why they were sent at all. Jefferson, as always, is playing chess 3 moves ahead. He's worried the Spanish will try to take the land back. He's worried about British fur traders slipping down from Canada. And he's definitely worried about whether this land can be tamed, cultivated, and taxed. So he authorises a scientific expedition, which sounds very nice and noble, except it's also a covert military scouting mission, because nothing says we respect your sovereignty like secretly mapping out your rivers and drawing battle plans. Meanwhile, the rest of the country is absolutely losing its mind over this new frontier. Land speculators swarm like mosquitoes. Newspapers print wild, unverified tales of mountain ranges made of salt, rivers flowing straight to China, and golden cities built by ancient peoples. It's a hype train without brakes, and you're aboard whether you like it or not. But let's not gloss over the bizarre irony of it all. The Louisiana Purchase was never really France's to sell. Most of the land had been under Spanish control for decades, and before that indigenous control for Mauritania. But imperial real estate is a game of smoke and mirrors. Ownership is just paperwork and cannons. When Napoleon signed that deed, he was trading land he had never set foot on, handing over the fates of hundreds of thousands of people without so much as a nod in their direction. Now here's a quirky nugget for you. When the news of the purchase reached Washington, D.C., Congress wasn't exactly thrilled. Some called it unconstitutional. Jefferson himself, a strict constructionist, had to stretch his own principles to justify it. Others thought it was a waste of money, too remote, too wild. One senator famously said, "We have land enough." History would love to know how long he stayed employed. Scholars still wrestle with the consequences of this deal. Was it visionary, reckless, imperialist, all of the above? The Louisiana Purchase set off a chain reaction of expansion, violence, displacement, and ambition that still echoes today. Without it, there is no manifest destiny. No cowboy mythology, no Great Plains genocide, no railroad snaking west like veins. It was the original butterfly flapping its wings, causing storms for generations. You walk now through new territory, boots crunching over frostbitten grass, eyes scanning a landscape that feels alien. The rivers are wide, the sky endless. The silence interrupted only by wind and the distant cries of birds you don't recognize. Somewhere nearby, an Osage village continues its rhythm undisturbed, until suddenly it won't be. The US government will start drawing new boundaries soon, sending treaties, then soldiers. You've bought land, but now you'll need to take it, and no one's going to hand it over. But in this moment, the future is still foggy. You stand on the bank of the Missouri, imagining what lies beyond. Your map is blank. Your orders are vague. Your sense of adventure? Off the charts. You've just inherited half a continent, and no one really knows what to do with it. You squint toward the setting sun and realize something terrifying and thrilling all at once. You've just become a citizen of an empire in denial. You pack light because you have to. Powder, lead, ink, a compass, a few changes of socks. Also scientific instruments, dozens of notebooks, beads for trade, and barrels of whiskey. Because diplomacy is easier when everyone's a little tipsy. You're not just heading west, you're being launched into myth. Welcome to the expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. It's 1804. The Louisiana Purchase is still warm, and President Jefferson wants answers. What did he just buy? What's growing there, crawling there, swimming through its rivers and sleeping under its trees? Is there a northwest passage to the Pacific hidden somewhere in the folds of all that wilderness? And most importantly, can this place be mapped, measured and controlled? You, Lewis and Clark, and a crew of nearly 4 dozen men, the Corps of Discovery, start at Camp Dubois near St. Louis and follow the Missouri River northwest. The plan? Travel all the way to the Pacific Ocean, alive preferably. But Jefferson's not picky. If your bones come back with useful maps and a few botanical samples, that'll do. Your boats are ridiculous, massive, flat-bottomed, overloaded keelboats with high sails and shallow hulls that bump every submerged log and sandbar. The journey upriver is a nightmare of rowing, poling, dragging and swearing. And that's before the bugs find you. Mosquitoes so thick they form clouds. Swarms that crawl into your ears. You smear mud on your skin just to keep them off, and even that only sort of works. But still there's awe. You pass wild herds of elk, prairies blooming in soft gold, rivers so clear you can see the pebbles 30 feet down. You encounter ancient bluffs carved by time and weather into shapes that resemble gods. Everything feels bigger than you, more permanent, like it's watching. Now here's the real trick. You're not actually alone. The success of this expedition hinges not on bravery or firearms or Jefferson's vision, it hinges on indigenous knowledge. Along the way, you meet the Mandan and Hidatsa in what is now North Dakota. They offer shelter, advice, food and warnings. Without them, the expedition ends here, frozen, lost, or simply swallowed by winter. But instead you overwinter in safety and learn the rhythms of the land. Then comes the game changer, Sacagawea. The teenage Shoshone woman, kidnapped young, now living with the Hidatsa, joins the expedition with her newborn son strapped to her back. Her presence doesn't just help with language translation or geographic familiarity, she legitimizes the group. When tribes see her, a woman and child among all those armed men, it signals peace. You're not a raiding party, you're something else. She saves the corpse from starvation, from diplomatic disaster, and even helps recover vital supplies when one of your boats capsizes. Her story will be mythologized, sanitized, even commercialized. But here, now, she's a force keeping you alive. And here's a lesser-known fringe tidbit. The Corps brings along a dog. His name is Seaman, a massive Newfoundland with webbed feet and a head the size of a saddlebag. He's not just a mascot, he's a hunting companion, a guard dog, and a beloved member of the crew. He reportedly fends off buffalo, scares off grizzlies, and endears himself to every native group you meet. Lewis becomes deeply attached to him. At one point, when Seaman is stolen by a tribe, Lewis threatens to wipe them out unless they give him back. They do. And Seaman finishes the journey, tail wagging. By 1805 you've reached the Rockies, and suddenly the plan doesn't work. Jefferson had imagined one continuous water route across the continent. You would paddle upstream, reach a high pass, and then coast your way down to the Pacific. Elegant, efficient, pure fantasy. Instead, you hit the Bitterroot Mountains, and it's like smashing into the ribs of the earth. Snow-choked passes, wind so sharp it peels the skin off your lips, you almost starve. You eat candles, you eat the odd horse, but eventually, with Shoshone help, you push through. You meet the Nez Perce, another tribe that could easily kill you, but instead feeds you. Then you ride dugout canoes down the Columbia River, past basalt cliffs and roaring falls, toward an ocean that feels like the end of the world. You reach the Pacific in late 1805, cold, damp, exhausted, and alive. You build Fort Clatsop near the mouth of the Columbia. It rains, constantly. You write in your journal anyway. You sketch maps, notes out new species, grizzly bears, prairie dogs, jackrabbits the size of cats, and prepare to go back the way you came. Yes, the same way, because there is no shortcut, no secret path, no magic door to the west. Just the long, slow work of understanding where you've been, now the scholarly debate. Was the Lewis and Clark expedition a noble mission of discovery or the vanguard of conquest? Some say it was simply scientific exploration. Others argue it was imperial reconnaissance, scouting for future forts, invasions and land seizures. Both are true. You shook hands with tribes and mapped their rivers in the same breath. You accepted hospitality with one hand and prepared for potential battles with the other. And that duality defines the frontier forever. Awe and ambition, curiosity and cruelty. The Corps of Discovery returns in 1806 to a hero's welcome. The maps they bring back are invaluable, but their journey marks something even bigger, the beginning of American certainty. Now you know what lies out there, you've seen it, and the country is about to start marching toward it with rifles in hand. You're no longer explorers, you're advanced scouts for empire. You probably haven't heard of Zebulon Pike. Most people haven't, unless they live near the mountain with his name on it, Pike's Peak, Colorado, and even then he's more of a trivia answer than a household name. But tonight, you're saddling up with him anyway, because while Lewis and Clark were busy mapping a highway to the Pacific, Pike was stumbling into Spanish territory, losing his notes, and somehow becoming one of the most underappreciated and accident-prone frontiersmen in early American history. The year is 1806, and Pike's orders are vague in that charming early Republic way. Explore the southwestern portion of the Louisiana Purchase, chart the headwaters of the Arkansas and Red Rivers, and establish relations with the indigenous tribes out that way. Also, unofficially, poke around near Spanish lands and take a few mental notes. You know, just in case we ever want to accidentally expand that way later. Which we will. Pike is young, just 27, and ambitious, but he's no Lewis or Clark. His expedition is smaller, underfunded, and lacking in scientific pretension. It's military scouting dressed up as exploration. You and about 23 men leave Fort Bellefontaine near St. Louis in midsummer, dragging boats up the Missouri's tributaries, dodging rattlesnakes and arguing over maps that are, generously speaking, guesswork. The trip starts rough and just gets weirder. Pike travels up the Mississippi before heading west across the Great Plains, land that looks flat and empty until it isn't. You pass endless seas of grass that hide rivers, quicksand, herds of buffalo, and storms that can appear out of nowhere, tearing the sky open in greenish lightning. It's beautiful. Terrifying. You're not sure if you're conquering nature or just barely surviving it. Then, in the shadow of the Rockies, Pike sees something that stops him cold, a massive snow-capped mountain rising like a frozen fist out of the horizon. He decides to climb it, because why not? It's November, he's wildly unprepared, and this is America. You go with him. There are no trails, no climbing gear, and no plan beyond up. You freeze halfway, run out of food, and turn back. Pike never actually reaches the summit of the mountain that will bear his name. It's the most American moment imaginable. And here's your quirky twist. On the return trip, Pike gets hopelessly lost. Like dramatically lost. He wanders southward and, oops, ends up in Spanish-controlled New Mexico. There's a tense moment when Spanish troops confront him and his men, who are waving maps, looking confused, and very much trespassing. Pike is arrested and taken deep into Mexican territory for interrogation. Spain, understandably, is not thrilled about American explorers accidentally scouting its land. The Spanish, though, are curious. They treat Pike more like an odd guest than a prisoner. He's questioned, watched, and then, surprisingly, released, but not before the Spanish confiscate many of his notes, maps, and journals. So when he finally makes it back to the US, he has to reconstruct much of his data from memory. It's like trying to redraw the Grand Canyon from a dream. And still, Pike publishes a report that's widely read and influential in its own chaotic way. Historians still argue about the true goals of Pike's expedition. Was it really just scientific exploration? Or was it proto-espionage, an effort to quietly assess Spanish strength in the southwest, gauge native alliances, and see how far the US might stretch its borders in the coming decades? Probably both. Pike was a soldier first, a cartographer second, and a diplomat very much last. What's interesting is that Pike's journey doesn't create the same iconic myth as Lewis and Clark's. There's no grand narrative of Pacific triumph, no friendly Sacagawea figure, no epic national arc. Instead, Pike's story is full of bureaucratic awkwardness, wrong turns, and diplomatic tightropes, which makes it, in many ways, a more honest picture of how the American frontier often worked. Ambition fueled by half-baked planning, luck, and a lot of people hoping nobody reads the fine print. You cross through southern Colorado now, under towering sandstone cliffs and wind-scoured mesas, And think about what Pike saw when he rode through here. He was among the first Americans to document these landscapes, though of course they weren't new. The land was already home to Puebloan peoples, Apache, Ute, and Comanche. Spanish missions dotted the edges. Trade routes spanned from Santa Fe to Chihuahua to the Gulf. But in American eyes, this was all a discovery. Here's something historians point out. Pike's observations would later shape US attitudes toward the Southwest. His descriptions of New Mexican villages, adobe houses, irrigation ditches, dusty plazas became part of the Anglo mythos of a land ripe for conquest. A place of lazy governance and passive indigenous culture. It's pure bias, of course. Spanish governance was just as complex and entrenched as anything in the East, but Pike helped paint the Southwest as a waiting room for American expansion. And you know what? That perception sticks. Within a few decades, the United States will come back with troops and flags, reshaping everything from Texas to California. But for now, in 1807, Pike rides home with a handful of half-rewritten notes, a few Spanish souvenirs, and a sense that the world is much bigger and much more contested than anyone back east realizes. You camp under the stars somewhere near the Red River, the fire crackling low, coyotes howling in the distance. Pike is already asleep, dreaming about maps and mountains he never quite reached. And you're starting to understand that the frontier isn't just an adventure. It's a lie you tell yourself about how empty a place needs to be before you feel entitled to it. By now you've heard a lot of noise about Zegenheste, but in this moment, deep in the forested Ohio country, you hear something different. The voice of resistance. You're not alone out here, you never were. Every step westward has passed through someone's homeland, and now those someones are organizing. Their names will be mispronounced, their motives twisted, their legacy flattened in the long steamroll of American expansion. But right now they are very real, very alive, and very ready to fight. At the center of it all stands one man, Tecumseh. You walk into his world in the first years of the 1800s. It's a world crackling with tension, tribes pushed west by white encroachment, settlements mushrooming beyond treaty lines, and US agents offering bad deals with fake smiles. The Ohio Valley has become a pressure cooker, and Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader with charisma like wildfire, is done watching it boil. He doesn't just want to fight, he wants unity. He envisions a confederacy of native nations from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. One voice, one resistance, not just reacting tribe by tribe, but standing together with the weight of numbers and history behind them. And this vision, it terrifies the United States. Tecumseh is magnetic, tall, eloquent, a warrior and a diplomat in equal measure. You hear him speak in council meetings lit by firelight, his voice steady, commanding. He says the land doesn't belong to any one tribe, and therefore no one has the right to sell it. The only way to stop them, Tutu, he says, is to stand as one. He travels thousands of miles on foot and on horseback, from the Great Lakes to southern Alabama, trying to unite nations that have spent generations fighting each other. And people listen, but unity is hard. Some tribes have already signed treaties, others are wary of war, others still have been battered so hard they don't have the strength left to stand. Even Tecumseh's own people are divided. While he's away rallying the South, his brother, Tenskwatawa, also known as the Prophet, decides to act. And this is where the story twists. Tenskwatawa is a spiritual leader who preaches a return to native traditions. No alcohol, no European goods, no more deals with settlers. His visions, powerful, dramatic, laced with prophecy, draw a following. But he's not the strategist his brother is. In 1811, he leads an attack against US forces near Tippecanoe in what is now Indiana. The Americans, led by a young governor named William Henry Harrison, fight back fiercely. The Prophet's forces scatter. The village of Prophetstown is burned. Tecumseh returns to find the alliance in shambles. Still, he doesn't quit. The war is coming anyway. Because in 1812 the United States declares war on Britain, again, and the frontier becomes a battle line. Tecumseh, knowing that the US sees native sovereignty as a speed bump, aligns with the British. It's a cold alliance, more about mutual interest than shared values, but for a while it works. Tecumseh leads British allied native forces in a string of impressive victories. His tactics are sharp. He doesn't just strike with brute force, he maneuvers, outflanks T, and understands terrain the way most generals only dream of. He becomes a legend. To settlers, a threat. To indigenous warriors, a symbol. And then, in 1813, at the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh is killed. The details are debated. Some say he died in direct combat. Others argue he was shot while rallying a retreat. His body was never positively identified, only guessed at and then buried somewhere in the fog of war. But the effect is immediate. Without Tecumseh, the dream of a unified indigenous front begins to crack. His alliance dies with him. The British, always half-hearted allies, pull back. And the US keeps pushing west. There's a strange, haunting irony to all this. Tecumseh's fiercest enemy, General Harrison, later uses his frontier heroics to launch a presidential campaign with the slogan "Tippecanoe and Tyler too." It works. He wins, he becomes president, and then dies 31 days later from a cold he caught giving his inauguration speech in the rain. Justice? Maybe, but it doesn't stop the juggernaut of expansion. Here's your quirky sidebar for tonight. Years after Tecumseh's death, stories start circulating that he had placed a curse on US presidents. Every president elected in a year divisible by 20, the story goes, will die in office. Harrison, elected in 1840, dies. Lincoln, 1860, assassinated. Garfield, McKinley, Harding, Roosevelt, Kennedy, all fall in line with the curse. Reagan, elected in 80, is shot but survives. Coincidence? Sure, probably, but it lingers in the lore like smoke after a fire. Scholars debate Tecumseh's legacy fiercely. Some frame him as a tragic figure, noble, doomed, out of time. Others argue he was a brilliant tactician whose vision was centuries ahead. Still others say the very idea of uniting so many tribal nations under a single banner was flawed from the start, ignoring deep cultural and political differences, but they all agree on this. No indigenous leader before or since had a dream quite as bold. You walk now through what's left of Prophetstown, grassy, flat, with only a few memorial stones and informational signs to mark what was once a movement. The trees rustle around you and it's quiet, but not empty. The wind carries something tonight. Not defeat, not myth, memory, because Tecumseh didn't just fight for land. He fought for the idea that this continent could remain a mosaic of nations, not a single, swallowing empire. And even in death, that idea doesn't go quietly. You wake up with the stench of gunpowder still clinging to your clothes. The War of 1812 is still echoing in your ears, but here, out on the western frontier, it doesn't feel like national pride or abstract politics. It feels like fire, hunger, and loss. You're not in Washington, where politicians are dusting themselves off from the British torching the capital. You're in the forests of the Great Lakes, in the shadow of smouldering forts and trampled cornfields, where the fight was never just between redcoats and bluecoats. Here, it was always more complicated, always more personal. The frontier was the war's forgotten battlefield, a place where alliances frayed and homes turned into ash. And the people who paid the highest price weren't wearing uniforms. They were the native nations who had hoped, one last time, that Britain might save them from being swallowed whole. You're moving through places where whole villages vanished. Tribes like the Shawnee, the Miami, the Potawatomi, some of them still reeling from Tecumseh's death, had thrown their lot in with the British, believing that this war might be the turning point. That if Britain won or even held the line, maybe they could protect their lands from American settlers. It was a gamble, and like most bets made on the American frontier, it ended in disappointment. Even when indigenous warriors won battles, like the stunning defeat of American forces at the Battle of River Raisin in Michigan, they were punished in propaganda. That particular fight in January 1813 ended with a massacre of wounded US troops by the native allies after the battle. Remember the Raisin became a rallying cry war, weaponized by the press to paint all native resistance as savage cruelty. You feel it creeping in already, the erasure of motive, the demonizing of people fighting to hold on to their homes. Meanwhile, the frontier is in chaos. The British are focused on bigger fish. They have Napoleon on the other side of the Atlantic to worry about, and their American strategies are often half-hearted. They capture Detroit, then lose it. They arm tribes, then leave them stranded. They promise support, then vanish. And when the war ends in 1815 with the Treaty of Ghent, you realise something gutting. Indigenous concerns weren't even mentioned in the treaty, not once. Imagine fighting for years, watching your people die, putting your trust in an empire, only to be casually omitted from the final paperwork. That's the real story of the War of 1812 on the frontier. Not a clear win or loss for America, but a conclusive defeat for native hopes of halting expansion. The US claims victory, Jackson becomes a national hero, and settlers push forward, eager to capitalize on what looks like an open road. Now here's your offbeat, rarely mentioned fact. A surprising number of war veterans who served in frontier conflicts received land bounties as part of their pay. Essentially, the government said, "Thanks for your service. Now go take this piece of someone else's ancestral homeland and turn it into a cornfield." So now you've got grizzled men trained in combat flooding into what will become Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri with shovels, rifles, and land patents. The frontier becomes a reward, a trophy, a settlement bonus. But no one ever tells you who paid the price, and that leads to the next problem, statehood. Because as the land fills with new settlers, the US starts slicing it into pieces. Indiana becomes a state in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois in 1818. Each new state means new laws, new towns, and more federal presence. And with each one, the old treaties die a little more. The lands promised to tribes forever in previous agreements suddenly look very temporary when the surveyors show up with ink-stained hands and an appetite for rectangles. You ride into one of these boom towns, maybe Vincennes or Kaskaskia, places that feel like they were assembled from spare wood and stubbornness. There's a saloon, a courthouse, and a general store selling overpriced flour. The streets are muddy, the roofs leak, and every third building is a church. Or there's a strange energy here, equal parts desperation and ambition. Everyone's trying to be the first something, first lawyer, first doctor, first person to die of dysentery in a brand new state. But something's missing. You notice it when you look out across the plains that used to hold Shawnee villages. When you see mounds, those ancient earthen ceremonial hills, flattened for farmland. When you realise that the towns have main streets named after the generals who drove out the people who once lived here. You're not building something new, you're building on top of something old, and most people around you would rather forget that. Here's where the scholarly disagreement gets heated. Some historians argue that the War of 1812 marks the true closing of native military resistance east of the Mississippi. Others say that resistance never really ends. It just shifts, re-emerges, evolves. Both are true in different ways, but there's no denying that after 1815, the US government stops pretending that native sovereignty matters in the eastern states. The frontier is no longer a shared space. It's a prize, and if the land is the trophy, then force becomes the policy. You see it in the eyes of militia captains, now turned sheriffs, in the advertisements for land auctions, in the quiet, resigned departure of tribal groups ordered to move again to new permanent homes just a little farther west, always temporary booms. You stand at the edge of a small homestead now, looking at a crude log fence that cuts across a meadow that once held a centuries-old hunting trail. You realise no one here remembers the names of the people who walked it first. They just call it virgin land, as if it hadn't bled. The war is over, the maps are changing, and the frontier? It's no longer a negotiation, it's an engine. You can smell Texas before you cross into it. Dust, cattle, mesquite smoke, and something else. Tension. It crackles under your boots like dry grass waiting for a spark. Because Texas isn't just another frontier. It's a borderland, a riddle, a war zone dressed as a dream. And as you step into it somewhere in the early 1820s, you realise this place is already on fire, even if no one's lighting the matches yet. Technically, it's Mexican territory now. Spain lost its grip in 1821, and the new Mexican Republic inherited everything from California to Yucatan. But ownership in the borderlands is always more theory than practice. Most of Texas is a no man's land, a vast dry expanse patrolled by Comanche war parties, Tejano ranchers, and scattered Mexican military outposts that don't exactly scream confidence. Into this power vacuum walks the United States, not with an army, but with an offer. Settlers. Hard-working, God-fearing, gun-owning American settlers. Enter Stephen F. Austin, the so-called father of Texas. He's not looking for a fight, yet. He's looking to fulfill a land grant originally given to his father by Spanish officials. Now, with Mexican permission, He leads hundreds of American families, known as the Old 300, into southeastern Texas to start new lives. These settlers swear loyalty to Mexico, promise to obey Mexican laws, convert to Catholicism, on paper anyway. But we both know how that goes. The settlers pour in not just from the US, but from southern states. They bring their tools, their crops, and, crucially, their enslaved labourers. Slavery is illegal in Mexico, but in Texas, enforcement is patchy at best. Settlers call it indentured servitude or contract labour and go on with business as usual. You ride past the cotton fields worked by black slaves guarded by white men who call themselves pioneers. It's not just a land grab, it's the expansion of the southern slave economy, dressed up in coonskin caps. Now, while Austin tries to keep things peaceful, other Americans aren't so patient. Many settlers ignore the legal process entirely. They cross the border illegally, squat on land, and expect US protections. Mexico grows alarmed. By the mid-1830s, tensions are boiling. The Mexican government, struggling with instability, revolts, and its own identity crisis, tries to crack down. They increase military presence in Texas, end immigration, try to enforce the abolition of slavery. You can imagine how that goes over with the Anglo settlers. So when General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna comes to power and starts centralizing authority, Texans don't just resist, they revolt. You're now standing in Gonzales in 1835, watching the first shots of the Texas Revolution ring out over a cannon the locals were supposed to return to the Mexican army. Instead, they put up a flag that reads, "Come and take it." Subtle, elegant, Texas in a nutshell. From there it spirals fast. You know what's coming, the Alamo, but you might not know how weird and messy it all was. The Alamo wasn't some grand fortress. It was an old Spanish mission turned makeshift fort defended by a few hundred Texan rebels, including famous names like Davy Crockett and James Bowie. Santa Anna's forces, several thousand strong, surround the compound in February 1836. 13 days of siege, then an assault. Every Texan inside is killed. Every single one. It becomes instant myth. Remember, the Alamo spreads like wildfire. Within weeks, Sam Houston, former governor of Tennessee turned rough-edged frontier general, rallies a force of volunteers. They engage Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836. It lasts just 18 minutes. The Texan forces catch the Mexican army during a siesta, utterly rout them, and capture Santa Anna himself. The general signs a treaty granting Texas independence, under duress, of course, and just like that, a new nation is born. Yes, nation. The Republic of Texas, 1836 to 1845, is its own sovereign country. It has a flag, a president, a navy, and a currency that's worth approximately nothing. It also has constant border disputes, hostile Comanche raids, and an economy held together with string and bold lies. You walk through its rough-and-tumble towns, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and see saloons built next to printing presses, jails built from adobe, and lawmen who double as judges and executioners. It's part Wild West, part constitutional fever dream. But Texas wants something more permanent. It wants to join the United States. Most Texans are American by birth, and culturally the Republic is more Mississippi than Mexico. But the US government hesitates. Why? One word: slavery. Texas is a slave-holding republic, and by the 1840s, the balance between free and slave states in the US Senate is razor thin. Adding Texas would tip the scales and almost certainly lead to a political crisis, which is exactly what happens. Here's your quirky footnote. When Texas declared independence, it didn't just claim the land it occupied, it claimed a massive chunk of the Southwest, stretching all the way to Wyoming. On maps drawn by Texan politicians, the Republic of Texas is an empire unto itself. Spoiler alert, it never controlled most of that land, but the ambition was real and troubling. The scholarly debate here runs deep. Some see the Texas Revolution as a righteous struggle for liberty, echoing the American Revolution. Others see it as a naked land grab, a pro-slavery rebellion against Mexican law, fueled by white supremacy and manifest destiny. The truth, of course, sits somewhere in the middle. Heroes and villains share the same tenets. Noble rhetoric and brutal ambition walk hand in hand, and you're riding west through what will one day be Central Texas, crossing rivers with names you can't pronounce, passing Comanche territory where no Texan patrol dares linger too long. because while the Anglo settlers may have declared victory over Mexico, they've inherited a much older conflict, the war for control of the land itself. The Comanche aren't going anywhere, and neither are the dreams of empire. The Texan fire flaps above a new courthouse, half-built and already leaning. A preacher is giving a sermon in a saloon. Children play in dirt streets while men argue about cotton tariffs and cattle thefts. And overhead, vultures circle. Because no matter who wins, the frontier always takes its share. You ride uphill through scrub brush and wind-bent pine, and for a moment there's no sound but the clink of your gear and the slow exhale of your horse. Then you smell it. Animal, sharp and pungent. Something musky, wild. You crest the ridge and see a camp below. Smoke curls from a lean-to. Traps hang from tree limbs, drying in the sun. A man stands at the edge of the stream, waist deep in frigid water, pulling something from a steel trap with hands that look like leather gloves fused to bone. You've just stumbled into the fading world of the mountain men. It's the 1820s now. The fur trade is about to at its frothy peak. And scattered across the Rocky Mountains and their foothills are the loners, gamblers, and sometimes fugitives who make their living in this brutal, brilliant, and dying economy. They go by names like Bridger, Fitzpatrick, Carson, Glass, men who become legends, partly because they lived wild and partly because no one could confirm their stories. You don't become a folk hero by being modest. You join one of their camps for the night, and right away it's clear, this is not a place for comfort. Everything is worn to the edge of disintegration. Clothes are stitched with sinew and patched beyond recognition. Meat is smoked to the point of being indistinguishable from bark. Every item has a stree and a scar. And these men, tough as saddle leather, fluent in profanity, and often in multiple indigenous languages, live day to day on a knife's edge. The money's in beaver pelts, soft gold to the hat makers of London and Paris. Trappers spend months high in the mountains setting traps along icy creeks, alone for weeks at a time. Then they drag hundreds of pounds of pelts back to trading posts or rendezvous, those legendary once-a-year festivals of capitalism and chaos where trappers, traders, native allies and opportunists gather to swap goods, brawl and drink enough whiskey to paralyze a buffalo. At one of these rendezvous, maybe in Wyoming's Green River Valley or Pierre's Hole in Idaho, you get the full sensory overload. Shouting in French, English and Crow, tents strung with bright calico and gunpowder kegs, fry bread sizzling over fires, horses neighing, and a man named Pegleg Smith loudly betting he can drink half a bottle of castor oil without throwing up. He can't, but you don't forget the attempt. Here's your quirky, hard-to-believe fact. Some mountain men became so integrated into indigenous communities they essentially switched teams. They married native women, adopted tribal dress and customs, and served as cultural intermediaries between worlds that barely understood each other. Jim Beckworth, for example, a freed African-American trapper and adventurer, was adopted into the Crow Nation and became a chief, though scholars still debate how much of his autobiography is fact and how much is creative editing. And the truth is, these men wouldn't survive without indigenous knowledge. The land is too unforgiving. Native guides teach them where to find water, which roots won't kill you, how to read the clouds for snow, and how to stay alive when your horse breaks a leg 50 miles from anywhere. The relationship isn't always peaceful. Raids, thefts, and murders go both ways, but it's deeply intertwined. This is a story of rough coexistence, not clean lines. But while you watch the firelight flicker on a pile of stretched pelts, you start to hear the rumours. Beavers going out of style, fashion changes. The European appetite for beaver felt hats begins to fade in the 1830s. Silk takes its place. And just like that, a whole economy collapses. The men who've spent years surviving on boiled squirrel and whiskey for the promise of payday find themselves with stacks of unsellable pelts and no backup plan. Some drift into other trades, scouting for the army, leading wagon trains, hunting buffalo for the railroads. Others fade into the mountains, into myth, into oblivion. But before they disappear, the mountain men leave behind something more than just spent traps and empty whiskey barrels. Maps. Not formal ones maybe, but mental maps. Detailed knowledge of revier systems, safe passes, and friendly tribes. The trails they carve become the future arteries of Western expansion. The Oregon Trail. Portions of it were scouted by mountain men long before missionaries and families made the trip. The California Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, they all borrow routes discovered, shared, and sometimes stolen by men who had nothing but instinct and experience to guide them. Here's where the historians start debating. Were the mountain men just brave adventurers, or were they the soft scouts of empire, unwitting tools that made it easier for the US to invade, settle, and displace entire nations? The line is blurred. These men weren't soldiers, most didn't care about politics, but the trails they opened brought settlers. Settlers brought the army, and the army brought flags. You pack your gear at dawn. One of the older trappers offers you a piece of jerked elk, so dry it sucks the spit from your mouth. You chew it anyway and stare out at the mountains. They look peaceful, but you know better. This wilderness, this so-called untouched land, is already changing. The silence is an illusion. You can hear the echo of wagon wheels, of rail lines yet to be laid, of treaties being written in ink and blood. And somewhere behind you, east of the divide, a banker in Boston is already calculating how much timber he can extract from that pristine valley you slept in last night. The frontier isn't a place, it's a process. And the mountain men? They were the first chisel against the stone. As you ride away from the last trapline, wind tugging at your coat, the pine sap smell trailing behind you here. You wonder what stories these men told themselves to sleep at night. That they were free, that they were forgotten, that the mountains would never change. They were wrong. Your wagon creaks like it's already regretting this journey. The wheels protest every bump, the oxen grunt against their harnesses, and you haven't even left Missouri yet. The year is 1843, and you're part of the first wave of what will become one of the most iconic and overhyped migrations in American history, the Oregon Trail. This isn't a romantic adventure, though someone will later try to turn it into a board game involving dysentery and pixelated Orwell. Right now it's just hard. You're crammed into a narrow wooden box on wheels with all your possessions, and none of them are especially helpful when a thunderstorm hits. Your covered wagon leaks. Your boots don't fit right, and every family you pass either smells terrible or looks like they're 5 minutes away from giving up, but you keep going. Because the dream of Oregon, whatever you think that is brighter than the risks. You've heard tales, lush valleys, fertile farmland, rivers that run with fish, trees taller than churches. It's the promised land, according to every pushy newspaper editor and land agent from St. Louis to Cincinnati. The US government hasn't officially claimed the region yet. It's still being jointly occupied with Britain, but that doesn't stop anyone from assuming it'll all shake out in America's favour. That's what Manifest Destiny is for. Claim now, apologise never. So you join what becomes known as the Great Migration. Nearly 1,000 people, families, preachers, single men with suspicious pasts, all load up and head west in long wagon trains snaking across the prairies. There's no road, no trail signs, just ruts, camp rumours, and the assumption that if someone survived the last crossing, you might too. The first few 100 miles are deceptively easy. Green grass, water, game. But then come the Platte River bluffs, the arid plains, the alkali dust that gets into your teeth and lungs and makes your livestock stumble and die. You cross rivers that look harmless until they rise overnight and drown your wagons. You climb hills that weren't on your map. You start burying people, babies from cholera, old men from exhaustion, mothers from fever. You start counting graves. You were promised Eden. You get elbow deep in mud and death. But something pushes you on. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's hunger. Maybe it's the knowledge that turning back would mean you failed at the one thing you staked your entire life on, starting over. You hit Fort Laramie in what's now Wyoming, and the mood shifts. There's news from ahead, bad trails, stolen cattle, talk of snow in the mountains. You hear about the Sioux and Cheyenne, who watch your wagons with arms folded and horses ready. Some trade, some threaten, some just watch, and that silence can be worse. Here's a quirky detail. Almost no one walks the Oregon Trail riding in their wagon. It's too uncomfortable, too slow, too dangerous when things tip. Most people walk, over 2,000 miles on foot. If you make it the whole way, you've probably worn out 6 pairs of shoes, broken a rib or two, and eaten more boiled flour paste than any human should. And yes, dysentery is very real, along with typhoid, cholera, scurvy, and the occasional surprise death by axle. The Oregon Trail isn't a straight path, it's a slow-motion survival test with prairie dogs watching you poop behind a bush. As you get farther west, the air gets thinner. You crest the Rockies, praying your animals survive, and start the long descent into the Snake River Plain. is volcanic, dusty, deceptively dry. Boise is just a lonely trading post with a few half-melted candles and stale tobacco. The Columbia River looks promising until you realise it's nearly impassable and icy enough to drown you and your whole wagon team. Eventually you reach the Willamette Valley. Green, mild, full of trees and soft rain. It's not paradise, but it's not Kansas either. You throw up a cabin, you plant potatoes. You stare at your surviving ox, now one-eyed and liffering, and thank him like a war buddy. You made it, but the trail doesn't stop here. Others are coming behind you. More wagons, more graves, more broken wheels and broken promises. By the 1850s, tens of thousands are flooding west. And the United States? It formalizes control of Oregon after a treaty with Britain in 1846, just as predicted. The frontier moves again, and with it, the political gears begin to grind. Here's your scholarly debate. Was the Oregon Trail a bold act of democratic expansion, or a land grab fueled by propaganda and cultural blindness? On one hand, yes, it was brave. Ordinary people risked everything. On the other hand, indigenous nations like the Cayuse, Nez Perce, and Umatilla saw their lands overrun, their populations decimated by disease, and their cultures pushed to the brink. The trail was also a wedge, a tool to force treaties build forts and eventually draw lines that would be enforced with bayonets. And yet, even knowing this, you still hear the campfire stories. Of babies born in wagons, of miracles, of surviving another day. Those stories, even when wrong, are what fuel the myth. They give the hardship shape. And America, if nothing else, loves a good story. Especially one that ends with land and fences. You sit on your cabin porch now, staring out at a patch of wet earth you'll try to farm. Behind you lies the trail lined with skeletons, some literal, some emotional. Ahead lies a life you haven't figured out yet. But for better or worse, you're here. And the country just got bigger again. You arrive bone-tired, sun-scorched and emotionally fried, not in Oregon, but in a basin of shimmering red rock and bleached desert where absolutely no one expected a thriving settlement to happen. And yet, as the dust clears from your journey, there it is, a grid of orderly streets, irrigation ditches gleaming in the sunlight, adobe houses rising like mirages from the sand. You've entered Zion, or, as the maps call it, Salt Lake City. It's 1847, and you're travelling with a different kind of pioneer. This isn't a wagon train of restless farmers or land-hungry southerners. This is a religious exodus. You're with the Mormons, followers of Joseph Smith, a man who claimed to have spoken with angels and uncovered a sacred record of ancient American prophets buried in a hillside in New York. You followed Brigham Young, the iron-willed successor to Smith, after years of harassment, murder, and exile. Missouri, Illinois, Ohio, they all turned in on you. So you left the United States entirely, into the desert to build the kingdom of God in a place no one else wanted. The land you now walk on belongs to Mexico, technically, but as fate would have it, the Mexican-American War is about to end, and soon this isolated patch of nowhere will be absorbed into the ever-growing US map like a stain soaking into linen. But when the Mormons arrive, no one's flying a flag. There's no US cavalry, no one but native tribes, empty heat, and the sharp scent of sagebrush riding on the wind. The arrival is a miracle and a test. Brigham Young steps out of his wagon, looks at the cracked earth and the salty lake ringed by barren hills, and says, "This is the place." You're not sure if he's visionary or delusional, probably both, but in the span of months, the settlement begins to take shape. Canals are dug, crops planted, a temple site marked. It feels organized, intentional. You're building not just a city, but a divine outpost. The Mormon pioneers are like no one else on the frontier. They are not chasing gold, not fleeing debt, not looking to tame the wilderness in the Jeffersonian sense. They're chasing prophecy, the belief that they are the chosen people gathering in the American West to prepare for the end times. And that belief gives them a kind of eerie discipline. They work sun up to sundown, fast, pray. Practice plural marriage, yes, polygamy, openly, defiantly, believing it is a divine command. It shocks outsiders, scandalizes Eastern newspapers. But out here, it's just part of the plan. Now for the quirky but true, the Mormons straight up tried to start their own country. They called it the State of Deseret. And it wasn't just Utah, it stretched across parts of modern-day Nevada, California, Arizona, Colorado, and even Oregon. They drafted a constitution, set up a functioning government, and sent it to Congress. Washington looked at it, blinked, and said, "Yeah, no. But the sheer ambition, men, is staggering." While most Americans were barely surviving in sod houses, the Mormons were blueprinting a theocratic megastate in the desert. But nothing on the frontier stays uncontested. The Great Basin wasn't empty when they arrived. The Ute, Goshute, Shoshone, and Paiute peoples lived throughout the region. Relationships with them varied, some trade, some tolerance, and some very brutal conflict. One of the darker chapters comes in the Walker War of the early 1850s, when escalating tensions between Mormon settlers and Ute warriors led to violence, retaliation, and a brutal crackdown. And the Mormons, despite their persecution narrative, weren't exactly gentle colonists. They practiced forced conversions, enslaved native children under the guise of adoption, and built fortifications as if expecting the apocalypse at any moment. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the federal government is getting increasingly nervous about what exactly is going on in Utah Territory, as it was officially called after 1850. They hear rumors of polygamy, secret militias, religious courts that supersede US law. Brigham Young, now governor of the territory, acts like a king, appointing judges, commanding troops, and brushing off federal interference like it's a bad wind. This leads to the bizarre, almost comical Utah War in 1857. President Buchanan sends the army to rein in what he believes is a Mormon rebellion. The Mormons, in turn, prepare for full-scale defense, destroying supply trains, sabotaging roads, and calling it the start of the end times. The conflict fizzles without a major battle, but it sets the stage. The US government doesn't fully trust the Mormons, and the Mormons don't fully trust America. Here's your scholarly debate. Were the Mormon settlers just another group of persecuted people carving out a place to live in peace? Or were they empire builders with a dangerous blend of religion and authoritarianism? Historians still argue it. Some admire their resilience and innovation, how they irrigated a desert and survived isolation. Others point to violence, authoritarianism, and religious fundamentalism that stifled dissent and subjugated outsiders. Either way, they shaped the West profoundly. They weren't just passengers on the wagon train of American expansion, they were drivers. They built infrastructure, established towns, guided other settlers, and pushed trails farther west. And their vision, for better or worse, stuck. You stand now in a city that shouldn't exist, watching children chase chickens between adobe walls, the faint sound of hymns echoing from a tabernacle down the road. The mountains rise around you like granite guardians. The air smells clean, dry, otherworldly. You wonder how long they'll be allowed to keep this place. You wonder if they ever really owned it at all. Out here, the frontier isn't just political, it's spiritual. And sometimes, the most dangerous settlers are the ones who believe they've been chosen by God. You don't even need to hear it. You feel it first. A low, rhythmic pounding through the ground like a distant storm rolling toward you. Only it's not thunder. It's boots, hooves, wagon wheels, and the heavy clinking of greed on the move. It's 1848, and word has just travelled east like a lightning bolt with gold strapped to its back. Someone found flakes of it in a California streambed, and now the entire country is about to lose its mind. Welcome to the gold rush. The loudest, dirtiest, most feverish land scramble since the Louisiana Purchase. You're standing on the edge of the Sierra Nevada trying to catch your breath, but everyone else is running. It starts innocently enough. Just a few specks of gold discovered at Sutter's Mill, near the American River. James Marshall sees the flash in the water and mentions it to a few people. Bad idea. Within weeks, prospectors, land speculators, and dreamers are flooding into California from every direction, some even before it's officially American. Because, yep, here's the kicker. California wasn't even fully under US control when gold was found. The Mexican-American War was ending, and the ink on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo wasn't dry. Suddenly, the US government had to figure out what to do with a territory it hadn't even organized yet. A place with no law, no roads, and no infrastructure, but plenty of gold. By 1849, it's total chaos. That's where the name 49ers comes from, and you are one of them now. You arrive in San Francisco, which has exploded from a sleepy port town into a frantic mess of tents, gambling halls, and hastily built saloons slouching in the mud. Prices make no sense. Eggs cost more than boots. A shovel might set you back $100. And that's if you can find one that hasn't already been used to cave in someone's skull over a disputed claim. Out in the goldfields, it's worse. You pan rivers until your hands crack open. You dig holes that collapse on you. You swing a pickaxe next to strangers who might be your partners today and your murderers tomorrow. The gold's real, but so are the lies. For every man who strikes it rich, 1,000 barely find enough dust to keep themselves fed, and still they come. From Missouri, from Maine, from China, from Chile, from everywhere. The international angle is staggering. Thousands of Chinese immigrants arrive by ship, some bringing traditional mining techniques that actually outperform the slapdash methods of the Americans. Mexicans come north, many of whom had been mining experts long before California became part of the US. Free, black Americans head west, hoping the lawlessness might offer something like freedom. And white prospectors, driven by both paranoia and entitlement, immediately start rewriting the rules to keep the gold in the right hands. Which brings us to the dirty truth. The gold rush wasn't just about wealth, it was about exclusion. White miners organize foreign miner taxes, targeting Mexican and Chinese workers. Native Californians, already devastated by Spanish missions and Mexican rule, are pushed to the brink. Bounties are placed on their heads. Entire villages are wiped out in punitive raids. Between disease displacement and outright slaughter, California's indigenous population plummets by 80% in just 2 decades. It's genocide with paperwork. Here's your quirky fact of the day. Levi Strauss, yes, that Levi Strauss, arrives in San Francisco during the gold rush to sell dry goods. Legend has it a miner complained that his pants kept falling apart, and Strauss, ever the entrepreneur, fashioned durable trousers out of canvas. Eventually, he switches to denim, adds rivets, and boom. Blue jeans. A fashion icon born from desperation and mining grit. But back to the dirt. The rush isn't just physical, it's bureaucratic. California becomes a state in 1850 without even going through the usual territorial grooming process. The government rushes it in to try to keep some kind of control over the lawless madness. And because the South is nervous about all those free-minded northerners flooding west, it enters as a free state, escalating the already smouldering tension between North and South. Now here's a scholarly debate that never dies. Did the gold rush accelerate the Civil War? Many say yes. California's sudden population boom disrupted the delicate political balance. It gave the free states more power. It injected a wild, uncontrolled spirit into American politics. It also shoved indigenous genocide, land theft, and environmental destruction into overdrive. Others argue that while the gold rush poured gasoline on the fire, the flame was already there. As you walk through a mining camp near the Yuba River, you notice the desperation in every face. Young men, old men, entire families, all gambling everything they own on a sliver of hope. Some succeed barely, most return home broken. A few never leave, caught in the gold haze until they rot in a hillside shanty. And then there are the boom towns, Sonora, Placerville, Hangtown, later renamed something more polite. They pop up like weeds, grow into chaos, and sometimes vanish just as fast. Law enforcement is sketchy. Vigilante justice is common. Some towns have more brothels than churches, or the same building serving both depending on the time of day. You sit at a saloon, boots caked in red mud, watching a man bet his last dust pouch on a game of faro. A fight breaks out. No one flinches. The bartender pours another drink and says, "Happens every Tuesday." You laugh, but it sticks in your throat, because beneath the excitement, the gold rush reveals something ugly. The frontier is no longer about farming or freedom, and it's about extraction. Rip the land open, take what you can, leave the rest behind, and people become disposable. Landscapes become waste. And the American dream, that soft-spoken lie about opportunity and self-reliance, sharpens its teeth. You leave the camp with a few coins in your pouch, but no illusions. You've seen the heart of the rush, and it's not gold, it's hunger. The wind howls so loud across the open plains, it sounds like it's trying to tell you something, maybe a warning, maybe just mocking your choices. You pull your coat tighter and glance back at the fragile wooden walls of your half-buried sod house, wondering if they'll hold through the night. The prairie stretches out in all directions, a flat, endless ocean of grass and sky. Welcome to the Great Plains, friend. You're a homesteader now, and the land is trying to kill you. It's the 1860s and 70s, and the government, fresh off its Civil War victory, is in the mood to reward loyalty and fuel expansion. Enter the Homestead Act of 1862, one of the most ambitious and catastrophic pieces of legislation ever written onto American soil. The pitch is simple: move west, claim 160 acres of public land, live on it, improve it, and after 5 years it's yours as free land. It's just like that. All you have to do is survive. You probably won't. At first glance, the Great Plains look like easy money. Open, fertile, untouched. But when you step out here with your family and your wagon load of cracked china and high hopes, you quickly learn what the maps didn't tell you. The soil is stubborn, the seasons are cruel, rain doesn't fall when it's needed. Summers bring grasshopper plagues that strip crops down to stubble in a single afternoon. Winters bury everything in snow so dense it silences the world. Your sod house, carved literally out of the earth, is crawling with bugs, damp as a tomb, and so dark inside you might as well be living in a coal bin. You wanted a home, you got a grave with a stove, and still you dig. Because this is the promise, this is the dream. The newspapers back east called it a Garden of Eden. Politicians called it manifest destiny. You call it survival. You plant wheat, build a fence, wait for rain, repeat. Then come the blizzards, with winds so strong they shear the skin off cattle and rip doors from hinges. The fires moving so fast across the dry grass that entire settlements vanish in minutes. You watch a neighbour's house burn from 30 miles away, the smoke curling into a sky already thick with ash. Nothing out here comes gently. It all arrives screaming. And you're not alone. The Great Plains are home to nations who've lived on this land long before the word America meant anything. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Kiowa. These aren't scattered tribes, as the newspapers like to call them. There are nations with sophisticated economies, political structures, warrior societies, and deep spiritual connections to the land you just fenced. And that's where the real tension begins. Your fence isn't just wood. It's a declaration. The buffalo herds that once migrated freely across the plains, herds the Lakota depended on for food, tools, clothing, and ceremony, now find themselves boxed out, hunted to the edge of extinction. The US government doesn't just look the other way. It encourages it. One general famously said, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." Which brings us to the railroad. Ah yes, the twin steel veins of so-called progress. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific meet at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869, driving the last golden spike and uniting the country from sea to shining sea. It's a miracle of engineering and sweat, built by thousands of immigrant workers, especially Chinese labourers, who faced dangerous conditions, brutal hours, and open racism. But once the rail lines are up, everything changes. Cattle, timber, wheat, and you, all flowing west, all faster now. Your lonely homestead is no longer isolated. Trains bring tools, clothes, newspapers, and eventually land agents. Politicians, speculators. The land you thought was yours becomes the stage for deals you never see, treaties you never read, and policies you never voted on. Here's your quirky, under-the-radar detail. Many sod houses weren't temporary. People lived in those earthen homes for decades. Whole families were born, raised, and died inside walls made of dirt, grass, and stubbornness. Some even developed a strange kind of pride in them. Better insulated than wood, they'd argue. Holds heat in winter. That may be true. Still, you learn to kill centipedes with a shovel. And speaking of politics, the Homestead Act wasn't entirely free. Yes, 160 acres were technically no cost, but only if you met the conditions, 5 years of improvement, which meant actual farming, building, and staying alive. Otherwise, you could buy the land for $1.25 an acre after 6 months. That price tag may not sound like much, but for many poor settlers, especially immigrants and freedmen, it was everything. And even worse, much of the best land was snapped up by speculators, corporations, or railroad companies using legal loopholes to amass enormous tracts of property. So the frontier promise of equality, that was more marketing than reality. Meanwhile, the native nations are watching all this unfold and beginning to fight back. You hear of raids on settlements, army patrols wiped out, homesteaders disappearing. You learn new names: Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. Men fighting not for empire or expansion, but for memory, for the freedom to exist without fences, without government rations, without watching their children starve on broken treaties. This sparks what's sometimes called the Plains Wars, a series of violent, complex, and tragically inevitable conflicts between native nations and the United States Army throughout the 1860s and 70s. The Sand Creek Massacre, The Fetterman fight, the Washita River. It's not one war, it's 100 small wars, all driven by the same engine. Settlers pouring onto land the government promised wouldn't be touched. Scholars still argue whether homesteading was truly about opportunity, or whether it was just a state-sponsored form of settler colonialism. Were you building a future, or erasing someone else's past? Were you cultivating empty land, or just benefiting from a very careful kind of forgetting? You sit by your stove one night, listening to the wind beat the side of your house like a warning drum. Your crops failed this year. Again. The grasshoppers came back again. And your neighbour's boy died of pneumonia in September before the snow even fell, but you're still here. The land hasn't broken you yet. Not yet. There's a new sound on the wind now, sharp, metallic, and unrelenting. It whistles through canyons and echoes across plains that used to sleep in silence. You pause on a hillside, and there it is, a train miles long, spearing through the west like a steel arrow. Black smoke curls from its stack, wheels pounding the rails in a rhythm that drowns out everything else. The frontier is no longer slow, it's no longer distant. It's a schedule now, a timetable, a race. This is the railroad era, and you're living through the most rapid transformation of the American landscape ever attempted. The Iron Horse is more than just technology, it's strategy. It's the final phase of manifest destiny, backed by capitalists, Congress, and cannons. The rails don't just connect cities, they impose a new order. Wherever they go, towns appear, forests vanish, treaties collapse, and the frontier gets recut with ruthless precision. It starts with a dream, a railroad stretching from coast to coast. It's 1862, and while the Civil War is tearing the country apart, Congress passes the Pacific Railway Act, which basically throws land and money at companies willing to build the rails westward. Two giants emerge, the Union Pacific building from the east and the Central Pacific starting from California. Their reward? Millions of acres of land and federal subsidies for every mile they lay. You can already hear the whistles, can't you? You walk with the crews. The Union Pacific hires Irish immigrants and war veterans, many still recovering from battle and booze. The Central Pacific turns to Chinese labourers, thousands of them, often paid less than white workers and pushed twice as hard. They blast through the Sierra Nevada with black powder and courage that deserves more credit than it's ever been given. Avalanches, rock slides, sabotage, dynamite accidents, you name it. Still, the tracks climb. In 1869, the two lines meet at Promontory Summit, Utah, and a golden spike, literal shiny gold, is driven into the final tie. It's a staged photo op, of course. Bigwigs with top hats pose for the camera, while the actual workers stand just outside the frame, exhausted, underpaid, and mostly forgotten, but the message is clear. The coasts are connected. The continent is tamed, or so they think, because the railroads aren't just transportation. They're invasion routes. For the Great Plains, the Rockies, and the Southwest, the railroad is the sharp edge of empire. It brings settlers by the thousands. It moves troops faster. It carries telegrams, bullets, whiskey, and ideology. And the land it crosses, it's not just claimed, it's taken. Railroad companies are given every other square mile for 20 miles on either side of the track. That's millions of acres, sliced into tidy parcels and sold to settlers, investors, and developers like plots in a giant national monopoly board. You ride along with one of the land agents now, watching as he marks territory, not with a compass, but with a clipboard. He doesn't see the meadow, he sees quarter sections. The creeks aren't sacred, they're future mill sites. You ask who owns the land, and he shrugs. Not anymore. Of course, not everyone accepts this. Quietly, out on the high plains, the Lakota and Cheyenne see the tracks as an existential threat. And they're right. The railroads bring buffalo hunters, men with rifles so accurate they can drop a bison at 100 yards. These hunters aren't just in it for hides, they're part of a larger goal: exterminate the herds. You're told, quite explicitly, that every dead buffalo is another nail in the coffin of native resistance. In the span of 2 decades, over 30 million buffalo are reduced to a few scattered hundreds. The plains turn from a living ecosystem into bone fields. You ride past one of these killing sites, skulls piled in heaps taller than your wagon, men laughing as they carve hides from still warm corpses. Nearby a railcar waits, loaded with salted meat and horn. Nothing is wasted. Except the soul of the land. Here's your strange but true fact. Some railroad companies hired photographers and artists to create propaganda campaigns promoting the West as a paradise. Posters printed in German, Swedish and Danish flooded Europe, advertising rich farmland, low prices, and civilized towns waiting for eager immigrants. And they came by the thousands. Scandinavians to Minnesota, Germans to Nebraska, Eastern Europeans to the Dakotas, whole communities born not from exploration, but from glossy brochures handed out at train stations. The tracks keep going. The Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe slithers into New Mexico. The Northern Pacific cuts into Montana. The Southern Pacific links up Texas and Arizona. Railroads become the veins of the nation, but the heart they serve is capital. You start to see a different kind of frontier man now. Not the farmer or trapper, but the corporate baron, Jay Gould, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington. These aren't explorers, they are tycoons, bankers with armies, and they wield more power than most governors. Some historians argue the railroad civilized the West, others say it colonized it. Most agree it did both. It allowed families to travel safely and bring culture, education, and commerce. It also paved the way for forced relocations, ecological disaster, and the entrenchment of capitalism over community. The whistle of the train is both a promise and a threat, depending on who you are and where you stand. You arrive now in a town that didn't exist last year. Boxcars converted into saloons, a depot, a church built from rail ties. It'll either grow into a city or collapse when the mine dries up. Either way, the track keeps going. Towns are disposable, only movement matters. The wind shifts again. You hear another whistle, distant but closing fast. Another train, another load of people, cargo, change. You ask yourself, is this progress? Or just momentum wearing a top hat? It's the dead of summer, and the sky is blistering blue, like it's been baked solid. Dust sticks to your skin. The wind smells like sunburned grass and manure. You squint down the trail and see a plume rising in the distance. A thunder of hooves, the long, low sound of the cowboys' yell carried on the breeze. Then they arrive, a wall of cattle, horns swinging, muscles rippling, driven forward by the men on horseback who look like they were carved out of saddle leather and sweat. You've just landed in the middle of the cattle boom, and yes, it's exactly as dramatic and exhausting as the stories suggest. It's the 1860s and 70s, and the open range is a real thing. No fences, just miles and miles of prairie stretching from Texas through Kansas, up to Nebraska, the Dakotas, and even into Montana. After the Civil War, Texas is crawling with cattle, millions of longhorns gone unclaimed or unmanaged during the chaos. Problem is, they were worth about $4 a head in Texas, and $40 in the cities back east. You do the math. The incentive to move those herds is overwhelming. The only thing standing between you and a fortune is 1,000 miles of hard land, rivers, rustlers, stampedes, and thunderheads ready to knock you into next week. So, the great cattle drives begin. You ride with a trail crew now, following routes like the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, and the Western Trail. These aren't casual journeys. These are multi-month epics with dozens of men, hundreds of cattle, chuck wagons full of beans and bacon, and every night a new set of problems. You sleep under the stars if you sleep at all. You ride with a six-shooter strapped to your hip and a bandana over your nose to keep out the dust. You cross rivers chest deep and pray your horse doesn't break a leg in the mud. The cowboys, real cowboys, are nothing like the romanticized gunslingers you'll see later in dime novels. These guys are young, poor, sunburned, and often mixed race. Many are Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys who taught the gringos how to rope, ride, and survive the trail. Others are black freedmen, looking for something that resembles freedom out here, where wages are paid in silver and skin color doesn't always determine your worth. Still others are white southerners, displaced and looking to start over. You eat together, ride together, sometimes fight together. Oh well. But no matter who you are, the cattle don't care. You reach Abilene, Kansas, one of the first cattle towns, and it's chaos in boots. Saloon doors swing non-stop, whiskey flows, so do fists. You can smell the mix of sweat, beer, gun oil, and desperation from the edge of town. Dodge City, Ellsworth, Wichita, each becomes a wild stopover for cowboys who just spent 3 months in the saddle and are now paid in full and ready to lose it all in 24 hours. Lawmen like Wild Bill Hickok and Bat Masterson walk the streets here, trying to keep things civil with six-shooters and death stares. Here's a quirky little truth. Cowboys didn't often carry revolvers in quick-draw holsters. That whole gun-on-the-hip thing, mostly a product of Hollywood. Real cowboys carried their pistols low on their waist or in saddlebags. They weren't itching for duels. They were too busy trying not to die of infected blisters or snakebite. and when they fought it was usually over poker or unpaid wages, not philosophical feuds. But even as the cattle boom peaks, the open range is vanishing. And fast. You start to see barbed wire, invented in the 1870s and about as subtle as a guillotine for the cowboy lifestyle. It's cheap, easy to install, and it turns the free prairie into private property overnight. Ranchers begin fencing off water sources, grazing land, and entire counties. The big drives, they're no longer welcome. You witness the fence-cutting wars with cowboys snipping wire in the dead of night and landowners shooting back in the morning. It gets bloody and fast. Then comes the railroad, once again shaping the land like an invisible hand. New lines stretch deeper into Texas and the Midwest, reducing the need for long cattle drives. Now you can load your herd onto a train just a few days from the ranch. The cowboy is still needed, but the long trail rides, they're already becoming relics. And winter. Oh, winter. The blizzard of 1886 hits like a hammer from the gods. Temperatures drop to 50. Cattle freeze standing up. Ranches lose entire herds. The open range model collapses. It was already wobbling under its own weight, but that winter seals the deal. Scholars look back and see the cattle boom as a kind of frontier capitalism experiment. High risk, high reward, and ultimately unsustainable. Yes, it shaped the West. Yes, it made a few people rich, but it also romanticized a world that was never as free as it looked. The cowboys were laborers, not legends, and the cattle, just another resource to be exploited until it dried up or froze solid. Still, the myth endures. You sit by a campfire now, boots off, socks steaming, a tin plate of beans in your lap. Someone strums a guitar. Another tells a story that definitely didn't happen the way he says it did. The stars are enormous. The prairie so quiet you can hear a wolf coughing 5 miles away. And for a moment you get it. The romance, the sense of space, the illusion of freedom. But the wire's coming. The railroad's coming. And soon, the cowboy will be more legend than reality. So enjoy the ride while it lasts. You ride across a sea of grass that's almost empty now. Empty not because it was always so, but because of what's been taken. The wind still moves the prairie in waves, and the sun still rolls over the hills like melted copper. But something is missing from the land. You hear the silence before you understand it. No pounding hooves, no dust clouds rising in the distance. No black silhouettes spread out across the plains like drifting islands. The buffalo are gone. Just a few decades ago, this place swarmed with them. Millions. The American bison wasn't just an animal, it was the heartbeat of the plains. Every part was used by native nations, the meat-fed families. The hides made homes and clothing. The bones became tools, the skulls held prayers. The buffalo was economy, spirituality, ecology, and community, all rolled into a single shaggy giant. But now, as you cross this land in the 1870s and 80s, you pass carcasses rotting in the sun, their hides taken, their bodies left to bloat and burst. In other places, you find nothing but bones, mountains of them, piled for transport, bleached white and cracked by the weather. They're shipped east by the rail car, ground into fertilizer, buttons, glue, anything. And you begin to understand this wasn't just a side effect of expansion, it was policy. The US Army didn't kill the buffalo directly, they didn't have to. Instead, they stood back and let the hunters do it, encouraged it even. Generals openly stated that exterminating the buffalo was the fastest way to force native nations onto reservations. No buffalo meant no food. No food meant dependency. It was warfare by starvation, quiet, efficient, legal, and it worked. You walk now into a Comanche camp, what's left of it. Just a few lodges, patched hides, thin soup boiling over a low fire. These were once some of the most powerful horse-mounted warriors on the continent. The Comanche, known for their speed skill and relentless raids across the southwest, had built an empire of motion, but the horse needed grass and the warriors needed buffalo. Take those away and everything else collapses. The story repeats across the plains. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, nations that once moved with the rhythm of the herds now find themselves trapped on reservations, fenced in and cut off from their traditions. The government distributes rations. Bad meat, flour crawling with bugs, coffee so weak it's basically brown water. Indian agents skim profits, sell supplies, or simply let people starve. The goal isn't just containment, it's erasure. One of the strangest footnotes in this extermination campaign? Buffalo Bill Cody, the man who will later become famous for romanticizing the very West he helped kill. In the late 1860s, he worked for the railroad, hired to feed the crews by killing buffalo, over 4,000 in 18 months. He did it with precision and flair, even performing trick shots from horseback. Later, he'd turn this into a stage show, reenacting the slaughter in arenas back east, complete with painted warriors and cowboys riding in circles. The audience cheered. No one asked about the bones. You hear whispers now of the last wild herd, a few hundred buffalo hiding in remote corners of Yellowstone or deep in Canadian forests. They're ghost versions of what once was, emaciated, hunted, and surrounded by fences they can't understand. Eventually, small efforts to preserve them will begin, but by then it's too late for the cultures that depended on their abundance. Historians argue over whether this was genocide or just tragic inevitability. Some say the buffalo slaughter was collateral damage of industrial expansion. Others see it as an intentional campaign of ecological warfare. Either way, the result is the same: a landscape emptied not just of animals, but of meaning. The slaughter didn't just change the food supply, it broke the world view of the Martians tied to the buffalo. Children born on reservations in the 1880s would never see a live herd. The ceremonies, the songs, the dances, many were outlawed or forgotten. You see elders trying to teach what they can, passing down stories carved into memory rather than skin or hide. But it's not the same. How do you explain the thundering sky to someone who's only seen the wind? And here's something stranger. While the buffalo was being driven to extinction, American culture began to romanticize it. Painters like Albert Bierstadt and Charles Russell captured images of the great herds as if they still roamed free. Writers described them with awe, nostalgia, even reverence. A kind of national guilt began to settle in, but it didn't bring the animals back, it just made them a myth. Today, the buffalo appears on nickels, on park signs, on sports team logos, but in the moment you're living through, they're vanishing. Not slowly, but in an ecological blink. No other mammal in history has been brought down so fast by deliberate organised slaughter. And you feel that emptiness in the land. The silence is unnatural. You realise that you're walking across a graveyard so massive, so sprawling that no one marked the edges. No tombstones, just fences and forgotten trails. You find a buffalo skull half buried in the grass. You lift it, brush away the dirt. The horns are cracked. The bone flaked from years of sun. You wonder what it saw in its last moments. A gun barrel, a white hunter laughing, a train rushing past. You wonder if it heard its herd dying around it. You wonder how long it took to understand that something irreversible had begun. You set the skull down gently. There's no one left to mourn it, just you and the wind. The man rides fast and careless, his long blonde hair whipping behind him like a flag. His buckskin jacket is buttoned all wrong, his hat sits a little too proud on his head, and you can't tell if the glint in his eyes comes from arrogance or sunstroke. He's got a sabre at his side, a pistol on his hip, and a reputation galloping several paces ahead of him. You don't know him yet, but history won't shut up about him. His name is George Armstrong Custer, and his last battle is about to become one of the most mythologized and misunderstood events in the story of the frontier. You're in 1876, the nation's centennial. Parades are marching back east, flags are flying. The US is patting itself on the back for surviving a civil war, finishing the transcontinental railroad, and declaring itself a full-fledged empire in everything but name. But out here, in the hills of southeastern Montana, there's no celebration, just tension, and the scent of war. The US government had signed a treaty with the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne in 1868, promising them ownership of the Black Hills, a sacred region shimmering with spiritual and cultural meaning. Then gold was discovered. You can guess what happened next. Prospectors flooded in, the government looked the other way. When the Lakota resisted, the US declared them hostile for defending their own land. Classic. So now you're following 3 army columns sent to force the Lakota and their allies onto reservations, willingly or otherwise. One of those columns is led by Custer, already famous for flashy cavalry tactics during the Civil War and his press-hungry flair for danger. He rides at the head of the 7th Cavalry, convinced that a quick strike will bring glory and wrap up the so-called Indian problem for good. What he doesn't realize is that he's riding straight into a storm. On June 25th, 1876, near a lazy bend in the Little Bighorn River, Custer spots signs of a large village. Not a camp, a full village. Thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, along with their families, gathered in resistance under leaders like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall. This wasn't a ragtag war party. This was a community prepared to fight for its survival. Here's the fatal mistake. Custer underestimates everything. The numbers, the coordination, the resolve to... He divides his forces, less than 700 men in total, into smaller units, believing the village will scatter at the first sign of attack. He charges in before waiting for reinforcements. You watch it unfold from a bluff. Custer and his detachment are completely overwhelmed. Warriors on horseback swarm like hornets. The terrain is brutal, ravines, tall grass, sudden ridges, and the soldiers are outgunned, outmaneuvered, and hopelessly isolated. Within an hour, the entire detachment is dead, Custer included. The aftermath becomes a national obsession. The news hits the Eastern press like a gut punch. Custer's last stand, they call it. Immediately the myth-making begins. He died bravely. He fought to the last man. He stood atop a hill, defiant and glorious. Paintings show him surrounded by fallen soldiers, firing until his pistol runs dry. Entire books are written before anyone even confirms how he died. But the facts are messier. Some say he was shot in the chest. Others say the head. Instead, no one really knows. His body was stripped, mutilated, and buried in a shallow grave. The Cheyenne later said they didn't even recognize him until afterward. They weren't targeting a legend, just another soldier trying to take their land. And here's the bitter irony. Custer's death becomes the best thing that ever happened to his legacy. He's elevated to martyrdom, a victim of savagery. Politicians and army brass use the defeat as justification for more military action. What follows is a brutal crackdown. The winter of 1876-7 is a nightmare. The army hunts the Lakota and Cheyenne across the plains, burns villages, slaughters ponies, and starves people into submission. The spring, many of the leaders have surrendered. Crazy Horse is killed under suspicious circumstances. Sitting Bull flees to Canada for a time before eventually returning and being imprisoned. The last great military resistance on the northern plains ends not with a bang, but with a surrender forced by hunger. And the Black Hills, still taken, still mined, still desecrated. Here's a quirky postscript. Custer was almost court-martialed before Little Bighorn. He'd made enemies in Washington, disobeyed orders, and had a reputation for insubordination. If things had gone differently, he might have spent that summer in disgrace. Instead, he became a legend, largely thanks to his widow, Libby Custer, who spent the rest of her life shaping his image through books, lectures, and interviews. She turned a flawed, impulsive man into a martyr for American expansion. Historians today are still fighting over Custer's legacy. Was he a reckless egotist who got his men killed for glory, or a tragic symbol of America's overreach? Some even argue he was a victim himself, of a system that pushed men into impossible situations with bad intel and political pressure. But out here, on the windswept hills where the battle actually happened, those arguments feel hollow. You walk through the battlefield now a national monument, quiet and haunting. White markers show where soldiers fell. A few black ones now mark where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors died. Late additions, silent apologies. The grass sways in the wind, and you can still see the ridges and bluffs. Still imagine the thunder of hooves, the cries, the smoke curling into the sky. The story of the frontier loves to end with Custer. One last gasp of resistance, one final battle. But that's a lie. The violence continued, the erasure continued. What ended at Little Bighorn wasn't a war. It was the idea that the West could be taken without consequence. And yet, even in defeat, the Lakota and Cheyenne proved something most Americans refuse to admit. The land was never empty. It was alive, defended, and sacred. You leave the battlefield with your boots coated in dust and your head full of noise. Not the gunfire, that's long gone, but the echo of something older, something angrier, something that still hasn't quieted down. The gunfight happens in under 5 seconds. 2 men square off in front of the saloon, boots crunching in the dust, hands twitching near their hips. You blink, and it's over. One man gasps in the dirt. The other holsters his pistol and walks away like he just dealt with a plumbing issue. Nobody applauds, nobody screams. The Undertaker gets called and the poker game inside resumes. Out here, justice is casual, bloody, and often improvisational. Welcome to the myth-soaked mess of frontier law and disorder. We're deep into the late 1800s now, And the frontier isn't just a place, it's a stage. And on that stage there are no rules, unless someone strong enough decides to write them in bullets and bury them behind the general store. You walk into a town like Deadwood, Tombstone or Dodge City, and the first thing you notice is how temporary everything feels. Buildings lean, signs are misspelled, people move fast, sleep light, and don't ask questions unless they're paid to. There's technically a sheriff, maybe even a judge, but most of the time justice is handled by vigilantes, saloon keepers, or anyone with a fast draw and an ego. The federal government is slow to catch up out here, and the infrastructure of law, courts, jails, systems of appeal hasn't reached the end of the railroad yet. So you get makeshift solutions, miners' courts, cowboy regulators, and every now and then a well-meaning town council that ends up hanging the wrong guy. You sit in on a trial held in a saloon, where the judge is also the bartender, and the jury consists of whatever customers aren't passed out. The accused swears he didn't steal the horse. The owner says otherwise. Witnesses give conflicting accounts. The verdict is reached based on who seems drunker or more polite. Sometimes they just flip a coin. That's the level of due process in some towns. The frontier isn't lawless, it just has custom law. And the custom is shoot first, bury later. One of the most famous names you'll hear out here is Wyatt Earp. Lawman, gambler, enforcer, and occasional outlaw depending on the year. Along with his brothers and the famously mustachioed Doc Holliday, Earp becomes the face of frontier justice after the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881. Contrary to the movies, the actual gunfight takes about 30 seconds, and it's a sloppy, confused mess. 3 men die. The rest walk away surrounded in gunpowder and reputation. What follows is a bloody chain of revenge killings known as the Earp Vendetta Ride, and suddenly your town is caught in the middle of a personal war dressed up as civic order. And here's the part nobody likes to admit. Many lawmen were also criminals, or at least opportunists. They drank, gambled, fought in brothels, and played both sides when it suited them. Wild Bill Hickok, for example, was a gunslinger and showman who briefly served as a marshal, but also killed a man for cheating at cards and spent more time on stage than in court. His death, shot in the back during a poker game, cements his legend, especially since the cards in his hand became known as the dead man's hand, aces and eights. You also meet the real unsung keepers of the peace, townswomen, teachers, midwives and widows who form social clubs, write angry letters to newspapers, and pressure their towns into setting curfews, banning whiskey or, more radically, building a school. They don't wear badges, but their work often stabilizes places long after the gunslingers move on or end up face down in an alley. Some historians argue that these women, through sheer stubborn decency, helped close the frontier more than any sheriff ever did. Another strange fringe detail. Newspapers fueled the madness. Local editors, desperate to sell copies, exaggerated every gunfight into a legend. If 2 drunk ranch hands bumped shoulders and one pulled a knife, by the next morning it was bloody duel on the boardwalk. These headlines travelled fast, shaping the Eastern imagination and attracting more fame-hungry outlaws and lawmen to dusty towns desperate for order but allergic to boredom. And that's how the myth of the Wild West was born, while it was still happening. By the 1880s, dime novels were flying off the shelves, full of larger-than-life stories about masked outlaws, noble sheriffs, and daring rescues. Many of these stories were based on real people, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, but filtered through the lens of pulp fiction. In real life, Jesse James was a Confederate guerrilla turned bank robber. In the books, he's a Robin Hood. In real life, Billy the Kid was a teenage cattle rustler with a death toll under a dozen. In legend, he's a folk hero gunned down by betrayal. Some scholars argue the entire idea of the lawless West was exaggerated to justify Eastern expansion and investment. Look how wild it is, they said. Someone must bring order. Others say it was a genuine response to the social vacuum caused by rapid expansion, a raw society building itself on the fly. And then there were the range wars, violent conflicts between cattle barons, settlers, and sheep herders over land, water, and grazing rights. The Lincoln County War in New Mexico becomes a tangled mess of alliances and ambushes, with Billy the Kid caught somewhere in the middle. The Johnson County War in Wyoming sees rich cattlemen hire mercenaries to kill small-time ranchers accused of rustling, leading to standoffs, sieges, and yet more press coverage that reads like a Western opera. But what gets lost in all the shootouts and sensationalism is this. People just wanted to live, to raise families, to survive the winter, to have a little peace. They built churches and schools, threw dances, staged plays, planted gardens in the shadow of gallows. And maybe that's the greatest contradiction of the frontier, the violence and the domesticity side by side. A revolver under the pillow, a Bible on the shelf. You sit on the edge of a wooden sidewalk now, watching the sun sink behind false front buildings and telegraph poles. A dog barks. Somewhere a piano plays off-key. The saloon door swings open and two men walk out arguing about whose turn it is to buy the next round. Neither reaches for a gun, maybe tomorrow. Tonight, the frontier holds its breath. One step between chaos and order, always leaning slightly toward both. The dust hasn't settled yet, and already the frontier has been declared a man's world. Look at the stories, the songs, the statues, gunslingers, lawmen, mountain men, cattle kings and rail barons. They all cast long shadows. But while the history books squint into the sunset after men in wide-brimmed hats, someone else is out back milking the cow, patching a boot, delivering a baby, shooting a snake and burying the third child lost this winter. To fever. You want the real story of the West? Turn around. It's women who kept the frontier upright. You ride into a homestead now, not the mythical kind with gold pans and saloon jewels, but a small weather-warped house built from prairie sod. A woman stands at the door, sleeves rolled, hair pinned in a way that tells you she's been awake since before sunrise and will be awake long after you've gone to bed. She's not waiting to be rescued. She's hoping you didn't break the butter churn. Out here, women did everything because they had to. They planted, harvested, hunted, nursed, taught, mended, and sometimes buried. They were the glue holding together households scattered miles from the nearest neighbour. And the line between domestic and frontier work didn't really exist. You shoot the deer, she guts it, skins it, renders the tallow, turns the hide into boots, and cooks the meat for 8 people, 3 of whom are sick. And it wasn't just grit in aprons. Women shaped the very structure of frontier society. In places where men outnumbered women 10 to 1, especially in early mining and cattle towns, the presence of a woman changed everything. Suddenly, buildings weren't just structures. They needed to be homes. Schools had to be built. Churches, dance halls, bathhouses, civilization, for better or worse, started growing around petticoats and baby cradles. That said, not every woman out here was living the little house on the prairie fantasy. You walk down a muddy street in a boomtown like Virginia City or Dodge and meet working women of a different sort. Prostitutes, often called soiled doves or more bluntly sotting women, were integral to the social and economic engine of the West. They lived hard lives, often plagued by violence, addiction, disease and social stigma. Some ran their own operations, saved up and became madams or business owners. Others were trafficked, discarded and buried in unmarked graves. You can't separate the story of the West from sex work, though many history books try. It was survival, it was business, and for some, it was the only way in. Here's a surprising historical footnote. In many Western territories, women gained the right to vote long before their sisters in the East. Wyoming Territory gave women full suffrage in 1869, the first in the nation. Colorado followed in 1893, then Utah and Idaho. Why? Scholars debate this, but most agree it was a mix of progressive idealism, political strategy, more votes in sparsely populated areas, and, frankly, the fact that women were already doing the work. They were teachers, postmasters, landowners, and business leaders. Denying them the vote seemed absurd even to men whose job it was to shoot rustlers and shovel horse dung. You also meet black women, newly freed and heading west with families in search of something less deadly than the Reconstruction South. You meet indigenous women trying to hold their families together as reservations fracture traditions and the government outlaws their ceremonies. You meet Chinese women, brought over in secret, often forced into servitude, living in the shadows of railroad camps and mining towns. The frontier was diverse, and so were the women who shaped it. But they all had one thing in common. They endured. You find one woman's journal tucked away in a trunk beneath a broken sewing machine. The pages are stiff and yellowed. She writes about windstorms that lasted for days, about watching her husband's boots disappear in snow just before he did, about the silence after a miscarriage, about sewing dresses from feed sacks, about laughter by candlelight when the wheat finally came in. No heroes, no legends, just life. And let's talk about guns, because yes, women carried them, Rifles, pistols, hatchets if that's all they had. Out here, self-defense wasn't optional. Wolves didn't care about gender roles. Neither did outlaws or starvation. Women on the frontier knew how to load, aim and shoot with terrifying precision. Annie Oakley didn't come from nowhere. Ah, yes, Annie Oakley, the sharpshooting superstar of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. She toured the country, even performed in Europe, dazzling audiences with trick shots while dressed in fringe and lace. She was a symbol of feminine capability in a world that constantly underestimated her. She could outshoot any man on the roster, and did so with a smile. But behind the theatrics was a deeper truth. Women had always been marksmen out of necessity. She just made it glamorous. Still, despite all this, many women out west were not free. They were bound by legal systems that still treated them as property, by husbands who held full authority over their finances and bodies, and by social norms that punished them for stepping outside their place. A woman who divorced her husband, regardless of his crimes, might be cast out from the community, her children taken, her name smeared, and yet you find her anyway, the widow rancher, the schoolmarm with a rifle over her desk, the stagecoach driver, the photographer, the newspaper editor, the vigilante. Women weren't just surviving the frontier, they were defining it. Historians still debate how much recognition frontier women deserve. Some say they were agents of civilization, taming the wild land. Others argue they were just as complicit in the colonial machinery, benefiting from land taken by force and helping to erase indigenous cultures through mission work and assimilation. Both views have weight. The truth is complicated, just like the women themselves. You walk out of that homestead now, tipping your hat to a woman who didn't ask for thanks, didn't wait for permission, and didn't care about the story people would later write about her. She's got laundry to do, chickens to feed, a rifle to clean, a neighbour in labour 5 miles away. She mounts her horse and rides without ceremony. Because out here, heroism wears a bonnet and boots and doesn't stop for applause. You hear the boots before you see them, rows of them, polished and pounding in step. Blue coats, brass buttons, sabres clinking at their sides. Flags flutter above the columns. The US Army has arrived on the frontier, not as a liberating force, but as a permanent presence, carving military order into a land that's already had more than its fill of soldiers. Forts rise like stone declarations across the plains and deserts, staffed with officers fresh from West Point and enlisted men just sober enough to hold a rifle. It's the late 1800s, and the Indian Wars are winding down, or rather, being smothered. After Little Bighorn, after the long marches and burned villages, the frontier becomes a checkerboard of forts and outposts, each one planted like a nail into indigenous territory. You pass through one now, Fort Apache, or maybe Fort Snelling or Fort Laramie, it doesn't matter. They all hum with the same uneasy energy. Bored soldiers, rotting supplies, mail weeks late, and an unspoken tension between the men inside the walls and the land outside them. And if you think the Army's presence means professionalism, think again. Life at the Frontier Fort is more boredom than battle. Days are spent drilling, hauling water, scrubbing latrines, and chasing deserters. Many of these forts are little more than scattered cabins surrounded by shaky fences, filled with soldiers who joined because they were broke, drunk, or fleeing something worse. There's a saying, join the army, see the West. What it should say is, join the army, shovel horse dung in the snow while an officer yells at you. Still, the army plays a major role in shaping what the frontier becomes. It builds roads, lays telegraph lines, escorts wagon trains, enforces federal land claims, and, most tragically, relocates indigenous nations by force. When treaties fail, and they almost always do, it's soldiers who enforce the consequences. They round up people at gunpoint. They escort families to reservations hundreds of miles from their homelands. They watch over the camps where food runs out, medicine never arrives, and death settles in like a long-term guest. You're with a detachment escorting a group of Nez Perce, led by the brilliant and deeply misunderstood Chief Joseph. It's 1810, and his people have been fleeing the US Army for over 1,000 miles. Across rivers, over mountains, through Montana toward the safety of Canada. It's one of the most impressive retreats in American military history. And yet they're eventually surrounded, outnumbered, freezing, starving. That's when Joseph famously says, "I will fight no more forever." And he means it. But his surrender doesn't bring peace. His people are not returned home. They're relocated to Kansas, and later Oklahoma, places far from the sacred valleys they came from. It's a bitter lesson, repeated endlessly. The promises are never kept. Meanwhile, on the Dakota Plains, the ghost of war rises again, this time not with weapons, but with ritual. You hear the drums long before you see the dancers. The ghost dance begins to spread among native nations in the late 1880s, a religious revival that promises a return of the buffalo, the disappearance of white settlers, and the resurrection of ancestors. It's peaceful, powerful, and terrifying to federal authorities. The army, already jittery, treats the dance as rebellion. They move quickly, sending troops to watch, to monitor, to suppress. The Lakota at Pine Ridge and Standing Rock are caught in the middle. Tensions rise. In December of 1890, just days after Sitting Bull is killed during a botched arrest, a group of Lakota, disarmed, cold and surrounded, are camped at Wounded Knee Creek. A shot is fired. No one knows who pulled the trigger. What follows is a massacre. US soldiers open fire on the camp. Cannons are used. Women, children and elders are killed as they run, many shot in the back. Over 250 Lakota die. 25 soldiers are also killed, mostly by friendly fire. For this, 20 medals of honor are awarded. Wounded Knee becomes the last official act of the Indian Wars, though really, it's not an ending. It's a closing of the trap. That's the hardest part of this chapter. The slow, bureaucratic violence, the way paper replaces powder. The wars shift from open battles to legal skirmishes in Washington, to boarding schools that cut hair and erase languages, to ration offices that trade food for tenants. The army doesn't need to fight anymore. The system does it for them. But let's not forget who else served. Because riding beside those blue-coated regiments are the Buffalo Soldiers, black cavalry and infantry units who served with distinction in the Indian Wars, the Mexican border patrols, and later even the Spanish-American War. Formed after the Civil War, these regiments, like the 9th and 10th Cavalry, fought under brutal conditions, often facing racism from their own officers, and yet they became some of the most skilled and feared fighters in the West. There's irony here, so sharp it could gut you. Formerly enslaved men helping enforce the conquest of indigenous people. History doesn't give out neat roles. Everyone is caught in systems larger than themselves, forced to choose between survival and solidarity. Many Buffalo Soldiers saw their service as a path to dignity, respect, and citizenship. Some believed they were bringing order. Others simply followed orders. Today the army forts have mostly vanished. A few became museums. Others are forgotten ruins, wind whistling through broken beams. But their impact lingers, in town names, in road maps, in the shape of America itself. The frontier didn't just grow, it was occupied, and still the war drums echo, in courtrooms, in classrooms, on reservations where water is poisoned and treaties are still argued. Wounded Knee isn't a distant tragedy. It's a continuing wound. You walk the parade ground of an abandoned fort now. The flagpole leans. The cannon rusts. Somewhere nearby, children laugh, not knowing what happened here. Not yet. The wind picks up dust and memory and history that still hasn't finished writing itself. You wake up one morning and everything feels different. The sky's still wide. The plains still stretch out like they have no end, but something's missing. It's not the buffalo, not the cowboys or the wagon trains. You've already said goodbye to those. What's missing now is the idea of the frontier. It's 1890, and according to the federal government, the frontier is officially closed, just like that. One sentence in a census report in the great American wilderness, once overflowing with legend and danger and opportunity, is declared finished. Of course the land didn't disappear, the mountains didn't pack up and leave, but the US Census Bureau, in its dry, bureaucratic way, explains that there's no longer a clear line where civilization meets savagery. No more places untouched by settlement. No more frontier line. Just people. Fences, railroads, farms, mines, towns. And suddenly, you realize the frontier wasn't just a place. It was a concept, and now it's become a memory. Not everyone takes this lightly. In fact, one man reads the census report and practically breaks out in hives. His name, Frederick Jackson Turner, a historian who in 1893 delivers a paper that will become one of the most influential arguments in American academic history, the significance of the frontier in American history. You're sitting in the back row at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, right near the world's first Ferris wheel, and Turner steps up and says, in essence, the frontier made us who we are. Without it, America might lose its edge. His frontier thesis claims that the act of taming the wilderness is what forged the American character, our rugged individualism, innovation, democracy, and restlessness. He suggests that the safety valve of the West kept the country from boiling over. And now that it's gone, well, maybe we should be worried. Of course, you squint at Turner's thesis and start seeing cracks right away. He barely mentions Native Americans, aside from labeling them part of the wilderness to be conquered. He glosses over slavery, Chinese exclusion, land theft, and genocide. His frontier is a blank canvas, a blank slate, a blank everything. It's an erasure dressed in academic robes. But the idea catches fire because it flatters the national ego. We conquered the West. Now what? You feel that shift everywhere. In the newspapers, which start running obituaries for the Wild West like it was a fallen hero. In the stories being churned out by pulp writers. In the museum curators who suddenly want tomahawks and rifles for preservation. In the Buffalo Bills Wild West show, which starts playing to sold-out crowds in New York and London, reenacting battles that had only just happened. The frontier becomes entertainment. You watch Bill Cody ride into an arena dressed in white buckskin, saluting a crowd of thousands, while real Lakota performers, yes, including survivors of Wounded Knee, circles behind him on horseback. It's surreal. It's history turned into a stage act. Children cheer for Annie Oakley's trick shots while their parents read brochures promising land and freedom. The show runs for decades. It tours the world. It shapes the myth of the frontier more than any battlefield ever did. And then there's Owen Wister, author of The Virginian, published in 1902. It's the first real Western novel, and it sets the tone for everything that comes after. Gritty cowboys, noble gunmen, savage outlaws, a pretty schoolteacher caught in the middle. You see the frontier becoming fiction in real time. Real places turn into symbols. Real people become caricatures. The messy truth is smoothed out into legend. Meanwhile, back on the ground, you see another version of the end taking shape. Fencing, filing, and forgetting. The US government starts absorbing the last fragments of native lands. The Dawes Act breaks up reservations, dividing tribal land into individual plots and selling surplus to white settlers. The goal? Assimilation. Kill the Indian, save the man, they say. Boarding schools cut hair, rename children, forbid native languages. You walk through one and feel your stomach twist, rows of beds, scraped heads, eyes filled with confusion and loss. And then you see the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, finally declaring that all Native Americans are US citizens. It feels like an afterthought, a bureaucratic bow tied over centuries of theft. Here you go, it seems to say. Now you belong, as if belonging was ever the issue. Here's your strange but true. The last land rush happens in Oklahoma in 1893. Over 100,000 settlers line up to race for land once promised to native nations. When the gunshot fires, they stampede across the plains like it's a sport. The dust they kick up is so thick it blocks out the sun. Later they call themselves Sooners, a nickname that somehow becomes charming. You stare at it all and wonder how the act of stealing land became a local heritage. But even as the frontier closes, something else opens up: preservation. You meet a Scottish-American naturalist named John Muir, beard tangled with pine needles, boots muddy and eyes full of stars. He walks through the Sierra Nevada like it's a cathedral and writes about nature not as a thing to conquer, but a thing to revere. Thanks to his relentless letters and lobbying, Yosemite becomes a national park in 1890. Yellowstone, established in 1872, was the first. More will follow, and then there's Theodore Roosevelt, the cowboy president, riding into the national stage like he just stepped off a dime novel cover. He hunts, rides, writes books about the West, and believes in the strenuous life. Under his leadership, millions of acres are set aside for parks, forests, and monuments. It's the beginning of the conservation movement, born directly from the fear that the wilderness, the American soul, is disappearing. Of course, conservation is also tangled with colonial guilt and elitism. Parks are often created by evicting native people, their spiritual lands turned into vacation destinations, but still the impulse is new. Save something, remember something, hold a piece of it in place before the machines flatten it all. You ride west one more time through a land that's no longer wild but still vast. The towns have grown, the trails have hardened into highways, the telegraph lines hum, the fences don't stop. You pass homesteads now with indoor plumbing. You smell coal smoke instead of campfires. The West is still here, but it's wearing a new face. The frontier didn't end, it evolved. And somewhere in the distance a boy picks up a toy pistol. A girl opens a book about Annie Oakley, a train whistle blows, and the myth keeps riding. So here you are, sitting in a diner off Route 66, coffee cooling in your mug, while the jukebox plays something slow and twangy. Outside, neon signs flicker over a gas station, a motel shaped like a teepee, and a gift shop selling plastic tomahawks made in Taiwan. A dusty wind pushes against the window, and in the distance red cliffs glow like coals under the last light of the day. You've made it to the modern West, and what you find isn't wild. It's a carefully manicured memory. By the time the 20th century hits full stride, the American frontier has become a brand, a commodity, a shorthand for adventure, manhood, rebellion, and authenticity. The land is mostly parceled out, the native nations are fenced in, and the railroads have been replaced by highways that hum with station wagons and convertibles. But people still want the feeling of the frontier. They just don't want the mud, starvation, or cholera. You step into a Western film set now, out in California or Arizona, or on a Hollywood soundstage. The saloon's facade is made of plywood. The horses are wrangled by animal handlers. The cowboys are actors with carefully groomed stubble and fake grit in their voices. But the myth they're selling? Oh, it's polished to perfection. John Wayne, with his square jaw and slow drawl, rides across the screen, noble and unshakable. He's not playing a man, he's playing an idea born from Frederick Jackson Turner, Owen Wister, Buffalo Bill and dime novels, then repackaged for mid-century America like it's comfort food. During the 50s and 60s, Westerns dominate the soul office and TV. Shows like Gunsmoke, Bonanza and The Lone Ranger pull in millions of viewers. Cowboys become heroes. Indians, rarely portrayed by indigenous actors, are cast as faceless enemies or noble primitives. The frontier gets whitewashed and simplified until it fits neatly into an hour-long episode with a moral at the end. But even then you see cracks in the mythology. You pass through reservation towns now, Pine Ridge, Shiprock, Windoput Rock, and see a different version of the West. Poverty is crushing, unemployment is high, schools are underfunded, and yet there's also resilience. You sit in on a community meeting where elders speak in Lakota. You watch kids learn powwow dances and build websites in Navajo. You realize the frontier didn't erase these people. It tried, but they're still here, still fighting for sovereignty, water rights, language preservation and recognition. And here's something your high school textbooks probably forgot to mention. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, founded in 1968, takes the fight back into the national spotlight. These aren't silent victims, there are activists, organisers, warriors with microphones and legal briefs. In 1973, AIM leads a one-day occupation at Wounded Knee, turning the massacre site into a stage for protest against government abuse and broken treaties. The FBI surrounds the area. Shots are fired. Negotiations drag. The myth of a settled West begins to unravel. Meanwhile, Latino, Black, and Asian communities who helped build the frontier are finally starting to push their way into the historical narrative. You read stories of Tejano Vaqueros who herded cattle before the word cowboy existed, of black homesteaders in Oklahoma and Kansas who carved out lives on the same lands others claimed were empty, of Chinese railroad workers who laid the tracks blasted through mountains and then were written out of the photographs. Their stories were never gone. They were just buried under 6 feet of whitewashed myth. And then there's the environmental movement, which really begins to shift gears in the mid-20th century. National parks, once preserved for rugged white explorers to admire, are now being reconsidered through lenses of conservation, cultural restoration, and access. You meet native activists fighting for co-management of sacred lands in Yellowstone and Bears Ears. Some win, others are still waiting, always waiting. Quirky fact, tourism becomes the new gold rush. Towns that were once ghost towns resurrect themselves as Old West attractions. Tombstone holds reenactments of the OK Corral shootout multiple times a day. Deadwood turns its lawless past into a casino draw. Even Wall Drug in South Dakota, a kitschy roadside stop with free ice water, becomes a shrine to prairie nostalgia, lined with fiberglass buffalo and stuffed jackalopes. You laugh, but then you look closer. These places are trying to keep history alive, in their own weird, commercialized way. It's not accurate, it's not always respectful, but it shows that the West still matters, still haunts the American psyche like a campfire ghost story we're desperate to retell, even if we have to lie a little to make it sing. Back in the diner, you chat with the waitress. She's from Gallup. Her grandfather was a Navajo code talker. Her kids are learning to rodeo. She nods toward the mesa outside and says, That's where my people are buried. And that's where my son practices his calf roping. Same dirt. You step outside. The stars above you look the same as they did 200 years ago, sharp and endless. But the ground beneath your feet has changed. Not completely, not finally, but enough to remind you that history never stops moving. The frontier wasn't a line, it was a pressure point, where different cultures, ambitions, and dreams collided in 1,000 messy, violent, beautiful ways. It was a myth, a nightmare, a hope, and it never truly closed. Now it's a mirror, held up to the nation that created it. And depending on the day, we either admire what we see or flinch. So here we are, finally pulling back from the fire, the last embers of our frontier tale still glowing soft in the darkness. You lean back in your chair, maybe on your porch, maybe in bed with one leg half kicked out from under the covers, and let the weight of it all settle. The whole sweep of the American frontier, from whispered legends in eastern cities to gun smoke on the plains, from the crash of axes in the Appalachian woods to the click of casino chips in Deadwood. It's been one long, dirt-streaked, blood-soaked, myth-drenched ride. You've walked with conquistadors and cowboys, sat in silent lodges with Lakota elders, hunted with Daniel Boone, planted wheat on land stolen by treaties written in bad faith and folded into manifest destiny. You felt the freezing breath of the great blizzard, the sharp sting of barbed wire across the palms, and the tremble of the ground as buffalo vanished, one bullet at a time. But now, with the timeline closed like an old well-thumbed journal, something lingers. The American frontier isn't just past. It isn't just gone. It's a mirror we keep holding up to ourselves, asking, what kind of people were we? What kind of people are we now? Because everything that happened out there, out on those trails and rivers, under those big skies and even bigger promises, left a mark. On the land, on the stories, and on the bones we still dig up, literally and metaphorically, every time we romanticize the West, or argue about what freedom really means. The gunslingers got their movies, the settlers got their plaques, the land got divided, paved, sold and fenced, but the echoes are still out there, in the way people fight over water rights, in the murals painted on reservation walls, in the wide open spaces that still whisper if you stop the car and roll down the window. You listen now, really listen. There's a breeze across the sagebrush, there's a story still unfolding. So maybe next time you see a cowboy hat or pass a lonely stretch of highway that used to be a trail, or catch a whiff of wood smoke in a national park that once held ceremony instead of campsites, you'll remember. The frontier wasn't just a place, it was a reckoning, and it still is. Now, lights low, fan humming, that soft white noise pulling you gently down, let your eyes close. Let the dust settle. Let the wind carry away the last of the trail. You've made it through the wild.